April 13th, 2009. A young man stands in his bedroom. April 13th, 2016. A young man and his friends stand before the door to paradise. Far away, the final battle against an ultimate evil is being waged. The sky cracks as reality shatters, torn apart by a monster. Another reaches out and turns the green sun black, a gaping maw that drags in what remains of the afterlife. The lone hero stands before the final boss. She opens a chest to summon 4 chosen warriors. The warriors do not come. This is not their fight. They have found a new world where they are free from the shackles of narrative. They are no longer Homestuck. That is how the comic Homestuck ended. Well, technically it ended with the credits a few months later, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the point is, the comic ended in a very unorthodox way that left a lot of people unsatisfied. Fortunately, when The Rapture came out, a news post from Hussey revealed that an epilogue was coming. 3 years later, the epilogues were released and oh boy! They did not make the vast dissatisfaction fans had towards Homestuck's ending any better. April 13, 2024. You decide to watch a 3-hour video essay about those epilogues. I'm Casey Jarms. In the past, I have made 3 different video essays on Homestuck. The first covered the themes of the comic and why it ended the way it did. The second covered why the comic got worse over time and why the fanbase died off. And the third was an in-depth look at Dave and Dirk Strider as characters. I highly recommend watching those videos before watching this one. A, because I want views, and B, because I build on the ideas I established in those essays in this one. Anyway, again and again, people have commented on What Killed Homestuck, that the thing that killed the franchise for them was the epilogues and the sequel. People really, really hate the epilogues, and Homestuck too, but we aren't talking about that right now. I very rarely see discussions of the epilogues that don't feature 50 people saying, don't read the epilogues, they're bad. Very few new fans actually read the epilogues because of the constant sentiment that you shouldn't, which creates an odd scenario where people who haven't read the epilogues repeat this and tell others not to read the epilogues, even though they have not read them themselves because they were told that they were bad. And I was swept up in this sentiment. I read the prologue in 2019 when it first came out, but I didn't get around to reading the rest of the epilogues because a friend of mine who was also a Homestuck fan said they were terrible and I shouldn't read them. And honestly, I did myself a disservice by not reading the epilogues. What I should have done is form my own opinion on a work after sitting down to read it. I only read the epilogues after I finished my second Homestuck video essay, and honestly, I enjoyed them. That isn't me saying they're good, that's me saying that I enjoyed them. The epilogues are very, very flawed, but they're flawed in a way that no other story I've ever read is flawed. They're flawed because they exist primarily to get across some really, really interesting, unique ideas at the expense of telling an enjoyable story or having characters act consistently. And as the Homestuck themes guy, I enjoy what they do to expand on and advance the themes of Homestuck in spite of their, let's be nice and call it creative writing decisions. Let's get some data. I put out a poll and received 40 responses from Reddit, Tumblr, and my YouTube community tab. 75% of the people surveyed had read the epilogues. Notably, all but one of the people who said they hadn't read the epilogues also said that they disliked the epilogues, and I definitely trust their opinions. Shout out to the person who did not read the epilogues but still strongly dislikes them because of trans Hit. I didn't know Hit was transgender. Good for him. People who only read part of the epilogues universally said they disliked them, while people who actually read the epilogues all the way through generally either liked the epilogues or had mixed feelings about them, and honestly that makes sense. To tip my hand briefly, the first quarter or so of Meat is bad, but once the central twist happens, I'd argue it's actually really, really good. Candy, on the other hand, is 95% terrible, but culminates in a few masterful scenes that almost make the rest of it good retroactively. Mixed to good is how I would rate the epilogues. As I expected, Meat was the clear favorite among readers. What's more interesting than the pie charts are the sections where I let respondents write their reasoning for why they liked or disliked the epilogues. People who hated the epilogues wrote, What they ended up making is not Homestuck, and outside of some incredibly tenuous connections to names and events, it bears only the most passing resemblance to Homestuck. Fuck you, Epilogues writers, hussy, and fans! I don't even have words to describe how the so-called Epilogues and later Homestuck 2 destroyed everything that the original comic created, and how that disgusts me. Their plot did not seem to merit existing, or merit furthering the story beyond its canonical ending. They just seemed to exist because people wanted them. Wild tonal whiplash as compared to the original comic, incorrect characterization, stupid events, generally unpleasant to read. Two different people made sure to point out that they hated the epilogues over a certain aspect of Jade's character, which, to be clear, did not happen in the epilogues. That plot element happened in Homestuck too. One person said they never read the epilogues because, like me, they heard the epilogues were bad. But the epilogues did have defenders who wrote, "Love meta content and the exploration of post-ending problems." For better or for worse, they weren't boring. I remember disliking the epilogues at the time, but I've kind of warmed up to them with distance. I like when stories bend the characters until they break, which the epilogues do. They're not trying to be a continuation. They're trying to make a point about fandom. I like the narrative concepts it plays with within the framework of Homestuck characters. I'd like to note that 4 different people brought up John and Terezi's relationship. 3 of them liked it, while 1 called it skeevy. The respondents with mixed feelings stated, everything that people hate about it are things that permeate Homestuck to their core. Right down to intentionally pissing you the hell off on purpose. Many of the ideas involved are phenomenal ones, but almost universally, the way these things are executed is terrible. The idea of 2 characters taking the reins of the narrative and fighting each other to take full control is a great idea, but the ways the characters were bastardized to give context to said narrative battle was a little too raunchy and childish. They expand on the characters in a very interesting way, but there's a lot of moments where the writing is bad. One concept was repeated again and again by respondents, an idea that is inseparable from discourse on the epilogues. They feel like bad fanfiction. To quote, "They were not written by Hussey, they read more like bad fanfiction than anything. A flagrant disregard for the source material, have such clear effort put into them that despite at no point feeling even remotely like anything but second-rate fanfiction. Candy reads like a bad fanfiction. I guess that might be intentional, but everyone acting out of character was lame. Out of character behavior feels like fanfiction. The characters are unrecognizable in all but name, and the plot reads like bad fanfiction." So, if people think the epilogues feel like fanfiction, we should probably discuss who wrote them. The epilogues were written by Homestuck creator Andrew Hussey, along with Homestuck fans Jennifer Giesbrecht, better known by the screen name Cepheid Variable, and CTSET, with additional contributions from Lalo Hunt, Aisha Yu, Farah, and V. According to Cepheid Variable, Hussey only wrote the prologue, the first few chapters of Meat, parts of the endings, and the Obama scene. Yeah, there's a scene with Obama. They also presumably came up with the core concepts and overarching themes of the story. I have seen speculation that the reason the epilogues are the way they are is because they were not written by Andrew Hussey. I disagree with this take. I would argue that the epilogues are the most Andrew Hussey-ass story I've ever read, even more so than Homestuck, and I mean that both as a compliment and as an insult. I think that Hussey chose people who understood the themes they wanted to get across and the story they wanted to tell. And at the end of the day, I don't really care who wrote the epilogues, I care about what they have to say about Homestuck. Let's lay out how this video is going to go. First, I am going to recap how Homestuck ended, because that is the bedrock that the epilogues sit on. Then I'm going to go on a random-ass tangent that I swear is relevant. I will then recap the epilogues, and finally, explain the themes and my honest thoughts about the quality of the epilogues. And you are going to sit through this incredibly long video because you read through Homestuck, which means you like things that are long and rambling. The ending of Homestuck is very complicated and is told in an obtuse way. Part of the reason it isn't liked is because a lot of people don't actually understand what happens. For example, back in January, I saw a discussion on Reddit about the ending, and someone said that they hated the ending because the kids were stuck in a box forever, and that very much is not what happened. To be fair, the comic doesn't really explain shit, instead relying almost exclusively on the Kuleshov effect and familiarity with the comic's themes to be understood. So basically, all of Homestuck is a massive time loop that results in the creation of Lord English. Lord English manipulates Alternia in the form of Doc Scratch to cause the troll session, that causes the kids session, that causes the noble session, that causes the cherub session, which ends with the creation of Lord English. Caliborn shows a later piece of this loop during his masterpiece. After the events of Collide, the kids go to the land of colors and mayhem to fight Caliborn. John, Rose, Dave, and Jade are sealed away in the ultimate weapon Juju, which is then unleashed on Lord English in the final climactic battle, except because John touched the weapon, he is untethered from the plot of the comic, and thus able to break the time loop. Instead of going to the land of colors and mayhem, John and company chill out on Earthsea. They don't pop out of the box to fight Lord English because they have escaped from Canon. The time loop cannot happen because the main characters have left the story. The credits released after Act 7 expand on this a little bit. We see more of how Earthsea functions in a way that definitely won't boil over into a civil war in the epilogues, and get more scenes of the main cast being happy. The exceptions are Terezi, who leaves Earthsea to find Vriska, and John, who is left feeling unsatisfied. From Terezi's messages to John, we see that the black hole alternate Calliope created is tearing reality apart. This is my interpretation, but I think John feels a certain amount of guilt for leaving his role as hero, for abandoning his destiny of fighting the ultimate evil to pursue his own happiness. Another world is dying, but John is ignoring it so he can have a birthday party with his friends. On John's 20th birthday, which in theory takes place on the exact day the comic ended, Caliborn messages John and taunts him, begging him to return to the story so they can fight. John refuses and smashes his phone, symbolically deciding to stay on Earthsea and leave the time loop broken. To be clear, I don't think he made the wrong choice, or at the very least, I do not think that it was the wrong choice based on what was shown in the original comic. Fighting Lord English accomplishes nothing other than satiating the ego of the comic's main antagonist by treating him as a real villain. The paradise the main characters create and the lives they are allowed to live by escaping the story are much more satisfying than fighting an arbitrary final boss. Besides, dooming Caliborn to irrelevancy is a more fitting punishment than killing him. But, still, there are consequences to that choice, and those consequences are what the epilogues are about. Anyway, it's time for an extended tangent about a media franchise that I made a deliberate choice to stop interacting with years ago because the creator is a transphobic piece of shit. Fortunately, I'm talking about that franchise in a way that is 90% me ranting about it being shitty. Let's talk about fanfiction. Fanfiction and other forms of fan creation are the backbone of a lot of fan communities, and few fandoms exhibit this as succinctly as Homestuck. Homestuck became popular through people on Tumblr seeing fan trolls and saying, "Hey, what is this Homestuck thing people keep talking about?" People are still making amazing pieces of fan art years after the comic ended. The comic's amazing soundtrack and a lot of its art were contributed by fans. And, of course, prior to mid-Act 4, the comic's writing was steered by forum suggestions. Fun fact, despite having written several novels worth of fanfiction and multiple hours of Homestuck video essays, I have never written a Homestuck fanfic. I have, however, written multiple Homestuck 2 fanfics. I'm that guy! The comic frequently referenced and parodied its fandom. This is seen most notably with the Dancestors, who are half jabs at online communities, and half making fun of flanderized fanfiction versions of the trolls, and with Calliope, who is a living embodiment of the comic's Tumblr fans. By contrast, her brother was in some ways a living embodiment of the Something Awful forum users Andrew Hussey used to have as an audience. By the way, when I say Calliope, I'm talking about the main timeline version, not the AU God version who spent years in isolation. I mean, could you imagine what a fanfic written by god-tier muse Calliope would be like? Anyway, Homestuck cannot be talked about without talking about its fandom. But, for a moment, I'd like to talk about another fandom, one that dwarfs all other fandoms in popularity. Harry Potter. I think we can safely say that Harry Potter is the most popular fanfiction topic of all time. Harry Potter is solidly the most popular category on fanfiction.net, having almost twice as many works as the second most popular category, Naruto, On AO3, which overtook fanfiction.net as the biggest fanfiction website years after Pottermania died down, Harry Potter is still the second most popular category, beaten out only by the entire MCU combined. And that's ignoring the multiple websites that existed solely to feature Harry Potter fanfiction. I've heard speculation that there might be more Star Trek fanfiction out there, but that's hard to quantify because a lot of Star Trek fanfiction existed solely in physical fan magazines, and even then, Star Trek had an extra 40 years of people writing fanfiction, and it's still likely that Harry Potter is bigger. Harry Potter had a cult following, and what I mean by that is that it had a following so big, it spawned more than one cult! You know, people say that the Homestuck fandom is bad, but I don't think anyone in the Homestuck fandom has created a Homestuck-themed cult. Yet. Actually, now that I say that, I've realized that I could see that happening. Anyway, as the massively popular fandom, the Harry Potter fandom codified a lot of fanfic tropes. It didn't invent any of these tropes, but they were so common in the Harry Potter fandom that the common online terms for some of these tropes are just references to Harry Potter. And by common online terms, I mean what TV Tropes uses. You're watching a Homestuck video essay, you do not have any right to complain about me bringing up TV tropes. One common trope in fanfiction is what that website calls Ron the Death Eater, where a good character in the original work is exaggerated into a cartoonishly evil version of themselves by fans who hate them. For example, Ron Weasley. Ron is a pretty nice guy in the books. He's loyal and friendly and fucking hates wizard Nazis, but a lot of fanfic writers didn't like the fact that he gets together with Hermione because they ship her with Harry or Draco Malfoy and treat female characters like props. So naturally, there were a bunch of Harry Potter fanfics where Ron is an evil asshole who everyone hates. And in some of them, he's such an evil ass that he joins the Death Eaters. You know, the wizard Nazis who he consistently hates in canon. A lot of fanfics made Ron unrecognizable because fans just didn't like him because of shipping wars. The Harry Potter fandom also codified the opposite of this phenomenon, what the website calls Draco in leather pants. In the actual books, Draco Malfoy is an asshat. He's a rich little fascist shithead who has essentially no redeeming qualities. His main character traits are hating poor people, hating minorities, and being a jackass.
And my parents worked for the man who killed your parents. Do you want to be my friend?
A lot of fans wanted Malfoy to go through a character arc where he stops being an ass, but that never happened in the books. The closest thing Malfoy has to a moment of human decency comes at the end of book 6 of 7, where he chickens out of murdering Dumbledore for the fascist group he joined. And after that moment, he still works for the fascists and tries to kill Harry in the last book. The version of Malfoy appearing in a lot of fanfiction is, for all intents and purposes, a completely different character. The classic fanfic Malfoy is an abused anti-hero who doesn't really believe in the prejudices he espouses, assuming he brings them up at all, who is a close friend and or love interest for Harry and or Hermione, but not Ron because Ron is a racist ass, unlike Draco Malfoy, who is famously the least racist Harry Potter character. Here's the tell. In the original books, Malfoy is almost exclusively referred to by his last name, but in a lot of fanfiction, he's called Draco. Severus Snape also gets the leather pants treatment a lot in fanfiction, although in his case it's a lot more justifiable, given the fact that the last book ultimately does come to the conclusion that Snape was a good guy, and to be clear, he wasn't. He was an incel who joined a genocidal fascist organization, and only felt bad after Voldemort murdered the one woman he had a crush on. Then he spent the rest of his life abusing children, most notably Neville Longbottom, who he hates because his parents weren't murdered by the fascist group Snape willingly joined. Woo-hoo-hoo! Snape is an asshole. I'm focusing on these two tropes in particular, but there are a lot of other stereotypical Harry Potter fanfiction tropes, like stories about the main cast kids, stories about time traveling back to the earlier books, alternate universe stories where Voldemort won, stories where the Slytherins are nice and heroic instead of Nazi assholes, stories that introduce new children of existing characters that were never mentioned for some reason, and this is less of a plot and more of a specific scene, but I remember seeing a lot of scenes of Harry talking to the painting of Dumbledore in stories that came out between the publication of The Half-Blood Prince and The Deathly Hallows. So, what does this have to do with Homestuck? Well, like Homestuck, Harry Potter also had an epilogue that came out years later in a different medium. Harry Potter and the Cursed Child was a stage play sequel released in 2016. It was primarily written by playwright Jack Thorne, with Harry Potter creator J.K. Rowling and director John Tiffany providing the story. And the Harry Potter epilogue is really bad. The play focuses on Harry's son, Goku Naruto.
That's stupid.
No, it's not.
Goku can eat my shorts.
Goku was a Super Saiyan!
The play focuses on Harry's son, Albus Severus Potter, a child with a name so terrible it makes the Dursleys' abuse seem tame by comparison. Albus grows up in Harry's shadow, leading to a rocky relationship that worsens when Albus is sorted into Slytherin. Albus's only friend is Malfoy's son, Scorpius. And by friend, I mean the two of them are very blatantly a couple. They spend all of their time together, are horrified by being separated, have secret late-night meetings, and would gladly die for each other. Scorpius gets jealous when Albus shows feelings for a girl, and his feelings towards Albus are directly compared to Snape's love for Lily. There are two versions of the play out there, the original terrible one and the rewrite that came out a few years later that managed to cut the play's runtime in half without compromising the story at all, which implies that maybe the original being 5 goddamn hours long was ridiculous. Anyway, the trimmed version ends with Albus coming out to his father. He of course doesn't use the word gay, because that word should only be used on Twitter years after a book is published, but he does explain that Scorpius is the most important person to him, and probably will always be the most important person to him. This line is not in the original. The original ends with the two of them going, "Hey, now that we saved the world, let's go get girlfriends. I agree, my mutual heterosexual friend. I also like women." Remember when people's main complaint about J.K. Rowling was that she was apparently too accepting of queer people? That was stupid. Hey, remember when this terrible play came out, and the primary complaint people had was that, gasp, a black woman played Hermione? Gosh darn it, this J.K. Rowling woman is too woke, rubble. Anyway, Albus and Scorpius decide to use a time turner to travel back in time to the events of the Goblet of Fire and save Cedric Diggory. You may say, hold on, that isn't how time travel works in Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, time travel creates stable time loops. And to that question, the play says, shut up! It's a special time turner that works different from all the other time turners because reasons. Also, this time turner gets smashed halfway through the book, but it's fine because Malfoy has a second super time turner, apparently. The boys save Cedric. Unfortunately, this creates an alternate universe where Harry is dead and Voldemort rules over the wizarding world. Why? Because, I shit you not, Cedric Diggory is so embarrassed about losing the Triwizard Tournament that he becomes a Death Eater. He becomes a Death Eater and murders Neville Longbottom. This is the plot of the official sequel. At the end of the play, after everything has been fixed, Harry says that Cedric was a good man who didn't deserve to die, except him not dying resulted in the fascists taking over because, to reiterate, Cedric was so upset about losing the tournament, he became a wizard Nazi and murdered a child. So, actually, it's good that he was murdered. The way the play introduces the evil universe is amazing. Some random kids walk up to Scorpius and say, "Happy Voldemort Day! I love celebrating the holiday that commemorates Voldemort killing Harry Potter. By the way, do you have a date to the Blood Ball, the annual party we have that is centered on blood purity? God, I love it when stories are subtle." After the mess with Cedric is solved, the time turner is stolen by Delphi, the secret daughter of Voldemort and Bellatrix, who was never mentioned before now. She tries to travel back in time to save Voldemort, but Harry stops her, accompanied by his new friend, Draco Malfoy, who is a nice guy now. The play is bad, or at the very least, the script book that I've read is bad. Maybe it's better if you see it as a play, although I doubt it's that much better. The dialogue is stilted and expository. Half of the play is just Harry explaining that he has a rocky relationship with his son. The time travel stuff is drawn out and cliche, and the plot is so fucking stupid. Like the Harry Potter series was heavily flawed, but there are at least moments in those books that were good. The step down in quality is shocking. Side note, my aunt knows that I was into Harry Potter as a kid, so she bought me the script book in 2022, and I just nodded my head and said thank you, instead of saying that I read this play 6 years ago and it was abysmal, and also I stopped interacting with the Harry Potter franchise because Rowling is one of the most influential bigots on the planet. Like, she is the figurehead of a hate movement. Conservative politicians are citing her essays about how much she hates trans people as they pass laws stripping away the rights of trans people. Like, she hangs out with self-described fascists because they hate the same people as her. I mean, Jesus Christ, J.K. Rowling is such a tremendous fucking asshole that the entire series is tainted by association to her, and I bet that trans hit person is just really, really angry that I dared to insult J.K. Rowling. When The Cursed Child came out, a lot of people called it bad fanfiction. Part of this is because it was written by someone other than Rowling, although, to be fair, she came up with the plot and approved the shitty writing. Like, she's at least partially responsible for this travesty, even if she wasn't the main writer. But of course, someone other than the original author working on a later installment in a franchise is common. For example, The Empire Strikes Back is just as deserving of the title of fanfic as Cursed Child or the Homestuck Epilogues. A New Hope was written by George Lucas, but Empire was written by Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan, with Lucas contributing the story. But of course, no one calls The Empire Strikes Back fanfiction. The main reason people call The Cursed Child bad fanfiction is because they have a low opinion of fanfiction. And admittedly, a lot of fanfiction is terrible. But so is a lot of professionally published literature. Like, it sucks that the term fanfiction is only thrown around when an adaptation is bad. That said, I do think The Cursed Child feels like a bad fanfic because it features so many plot elements common in fanfiction. Time traveling to past books, an alternate universe where Voldemort won, stories about the main cast's children, heroic Slytherins, Voldemort having a child. All of those things existed years before The Cursed Child in fanfiction. It even featured that scene of Dumbledore's painting I mentioned. Remember those two tropes I talked about? The ways characters are twisted until they are unrecognizable, so they can better fit the plot of a fanfic? Well, the Cursed Child version of Draco Malfoy is more similar to the fanfic version than the canon version, down to the fact that the script calls him Draco. And, my god, I cannot think of a more blatant example of making a character evil for the sake of the plot than Cedric Diggory becoming a Death Eater. Fucking Tara Gillespie couldn't write something so stupid. Harry Potter and the Cursed Child is a bad play that feels like a bad fanfic. And if you've read the epilogues, you probably know why I've spent so much time ragging on the plot of a shitty sequel to the shitty Turf Wizard books. You probably think I'm going to say that the epilogues are the Homestuck equivalent of the Cursed Child. And to that I say, kinda but not exactly. There is one key difference between the Cursed Child and the epilogues. The Cursed Child feels like bad fanfiction because the writer did a bad job. The epilogues feel like bad fanfiction because Andrew Hussey wanted to write bad fanfiction. When I read the epilogues, I don't see the same massive incompetence I saw in The Cursed Child. I see a talented writer telling the story they wanted to tell, a story that, as it turns out, most of the audience had no interest in reading. You're going to notice that this video is a lot less visually interesting than the other video essays I've done on Homestuck, and I know that's a bit disappointing, going from something visual to something essentially text-based. Anyway, let's talk about the epilogues. Only took me half an hour to reach this point, yay. Let's open up the epilogues, and this is AO3. This is an archive of our own title page, complete with a rating, ship category, character list, and content warning. Like a lot of people say, I think the Homestuck epilogues are like fanfiction, as if that is some grand original criticism and not a blatant intentional aspect of the writing. Like from page 1, it is clear that the epilogues are a commentary on bad fanfiction, just like the original comic was a commentary on the nature of storytelling. Jesus, that's a lot of content warnings.
Warning. Graphic depictions of violence, major character death, rape, the economy, xenophobia, pregnancy, alternate universe, mind control, non-com, breastfeeding, misogyny, sexism, transphobia, misgendering, canon compliance, canon divergent, redemption, dubious consent, mind break, world war, political intrigue, robots, child abuse, rough sex, child neglect, alcohol use, breast milk, death, incestuous undertones, mental illness, suicide, polyamory, clown dynamics, meta abuse, fridging, genocide, diapers, murder, honk, children, gender transition, depression, toxic masculinity, sexual abuse, friends to lovers, speciesism, babies, manipulation, gore, infidelity, marriage, non-binary characters, smoking, identity questioning, feed, political rebellion, fascism, rapping, drug use, funerals, religion, eating food, aliens, possession, white BDSM, theft, furry, anthropomorphic characters, interspecies relationships, guns, war, assassination, alien biology, detransitioning, chronic illness, vomit, drugging, cannibalism, unhealthy relationships, capitalism, eggs, slut-shaming, black romance, kidnapping, fago, biblification, poisoning, teenagers, domestic abuse, reality television, ovipositioning, ghosts, revolutionary rhetoric, self-sacrifice, propaganda, super PACs, pica, early 20th century dance movements, prison camps, existential crisis, xenophilia, daddy issues, bad parenting, addiction, clown.
Oh boy, this isn't a joke. I mean, it is a joke, like the long list of disturbing content and sensitive topics mixed with things like children and early 20th century dance movements is meant to be comedic, but it is true that all of these things happen in the epilogues, and I mean, Andrew Hussey did warn us. Like, the epilogues deal with heavy subject matter, but begin with the content warning for that subject matter, and still one of the chief complaints I've seen of the epilogues is that they feature things like transphobia, unhealthy relationships, child abuse, and clown, which the content warnings did warn about. Let's just jump in. It starts with a crack. Everything else rises up from that like steam. A trembling thread that cuts through space in jagged lines, splintering the void into razor-sharp shards of putrefying leptons and quarks popping apart like raw eggs in a microwave. It's coming undone at a subatomic level, from the bottom up, from the inside out. From the top down, it looks like the eye of a storm, a black hole so supermassive that it spans the width of eternity. It turns infinity into something as thin and fragile as cellophane, shreds it of its dimensions, a piece of paper pinched together at either end, a hole poked through it. At the center of that hole, the edges can be heard fraying. Pandemonium as continuity buckles in the middle and the two ends come smashing together. Around the hole, ghosts scream. They claw at the dying borders of their dreams with fingernail-chipping desperation. They whip together like the wind, trailing the mutilated streaks of their hypothetical futures with them. It's a multifractal neon cyclone of primordial conclusion, a churning blender of hyperfinal, catastrophically terminal, overwhelmingly permanent double death. The screaming distorts and plunges low as it gets closer to the cavity. At the center, that distortion turns into an eerie music. That's where the cacophony ends. The shattering, the screaming, the squelching, the sounds of elemental particles being torn apart like string cheese shoved through a meat grinder, then dumped down a strangely melodious garbage disposal. It all returns to the same tonic dominant, matching pitch and tone, ironing out the rebellious flats and sharps until the discordance becomes exquisite. A subharmonic symphony that can only be heard in the bones. At the dead center of the event, it is extremely quiet. A silence made of all the suffering that limitless sempiternity can hold, bleeding together until the prism turns to obsidian. It's too vast to comprehend, too black to behold without closing your eyes. Retreating to the back of your own eyelids is to seek the comfort of a familiar darkness. It is to reject an absolute tenebrosity so perfectly alien, it threatens to rip the humanity right through your eye sockets. This is the end of everything. This is the end of paradox space. Goddamn, that is some good prose. Makes my poetic description from the start of this video look shitty by comparison. Like, if you're going to go from a comic to a book, having good descriptive text really helps that transition go smoothly. Prologue begins on April 13, 10 years after the start of Homestuck. John has a nightmare about the ending of Homestuck, about the Muse's black hole tearing reality apart. John is called by Rose, who is suffering from debilitating visions. Rose explains that her god powers have grown over the years, allowing her to see other timelines, and are so strong, she is dying. Fortunately, no one else has grown in power since Homestuck ended, hopefully. Rose explains some very, very meta concepts about how the idea of canon exists in Homestuck. She brings up what she calls the 3 pillars of canon: relevant, essential, and true. True is self-explanatory, whether it happened or it didn't. Relevant and essential are almost synonymous. Like, something being inessential or irrelevant means it doesn't really matter. Like a fanfic, or actually this is a better analogy, an anime filler arc. Filler arcs can be irrelevant to the main plot, but they aren't necessarily untrue unless they contradict the manga, and some filler arcs are actually good and advance characters, but they still aren't canon. That doesn't mean they're bad, although a lot of filler is bad. It just means it isn't a core part of the story. According to Rose, things that are essential or relevant stop mattering if they become untrue. If they contradict what is canon, they become completely irrelevant and inessential. The time loop that creates Lord English is the bedrock that the story of Homestuck rested on. The only way John and company could escape that loop was by leaving the story and traveling to a different universe that exists outside of canon. The ending happened, but it also didn't, because it violated the established order of events. Like Earthsea, as it was shown in the Rapture and the credits, exists in this quantum state where it happened, but also could not have happened. Earthsea will become fully non-canon unless John returns to canon and fights Lord English. If he doesn't, then things are gonna get weird. Earthsea is going to unravel and its inhabitants will slowly become more and more unstable as the gap between them and the canon timeline widens until they are completely unrecognizable. Basically, John has 2 options. Fight Lord English and undermine the comic's beautiful ending, or sit back and watch as the world falls apart. John talks things over with Roxy and Calliope at a picnic. Calliope says that John shouldn't make a decision on an empty stomach and offers him 2 lunches, a pile of raw meat and a heap of colorful candy. The meat will be rich and filling, a real meal, but it'll be bloody and tough to swallow. The candy, on the other hand, will be sweet and enjoyable, but too much can make you sick. Meat or candy, John? Meat or candy? In case the metaphor wasn't clear, John is choosing between fighting Lord English to protect Canon and abandoning Canon to keep living on Earthsea. You'll notice that I've been saying epilogues, not epilogue. That's because after the prologue, the story branches into 2 separate sequels, one where John returns to Canon and one where he doesn't. The symbolism of meat and candy harkens back to the favorite foods of the cherubs. You know, Caliborn, who was obsessed with narrative and becoming its villain, and Calliope, who was primarily concerned with the bonds and friendships she had with other characters. Candy is also a reference to the tricksters, who are cheery and overexcited and want to solve relationships by marrying everyone and having a bunch of babies, and were created by a piece of candy. The dichotomy of meat and candy was previously brought up by Hussey in the commentary of the 3rd printed Homestuck book while talking about Jack Ascend. Hussey explained that they consider meat to be violent, high-octane moments that advance the plot, presumably compared to candy, which I would assume is smaller moments dedicated to comedy, relationships, and establishing characters. In theory, the meat epilogue will be violent and advance the plot, while the candy epilogue will be cozy and relationship-focused. This promise is unfortunately abandoned by the epilogues pretty quickly. Meat first is generally the preferred way to read the epilogues. It's listed first, it's the more popular of the 2 stories, and there are scenes in Candy that hinge on you having read Meat first. There's also a point in Meat where Dirk says to stop reading Meat and go read Candy, so reading the first half of Meat, all of Candy, then the rest of Meat is also popular. I'm going to be jumping between the 2 and rearranging scenes as needed to better get across my points. I'm going to start with John beating up that dickhole, Lord English. John can't bring anyone else from Earthsea on this mission. The others are tainted by the ending of the comic and thus unable to participate in its plot. But John's retcon powers keep him immune to the non-canonification of Earthsea. John instead recruits the younger versions of the cast from the Game Over timeline. Meanwhile, it's revealed that Jane is running for president of Earth. This worries Dave because Jane is a bit of a fascist. Hey, remember how in Homestuck Jane was a fascist? Yes, being a fascist was Jane's primary character trait, if I remember correctly. And this isn't just Dave exaggerating and being reductive for comedy. Jane's policies are pretty uncomfortable. So basically, remember how at the end of Homestuck the main character split the world into 4 different kingdoms and repopulated it using ectobiology before fucking off for 1,000 years? Hey, turns out that caused problems because trolls need the mother grub to reproduce, and Kanaya didn't hatch a new mother grub until after returning. So basically, the gang created a world where the reproduction of trolls is controlled by the government, a government that quickly became mostly controlled by humans because the human population can rise normally. And big chunks of the human government, as well as Jane, want to keep troll reproduction low because otherwise they could overbreed and take over the world. And you know these trolls. They're inherently violent conquerors. You saw what Alternia was like. Except, hold on, it's explicitly shown that Alternia is the way it is because of Lord English's meddling. Like, Bepharus wasn't a violent interplanetary empire with mass killings of disabled people. It was a patronizing nanny state, but it wasn't the fascist hellhole that Alternia was. There is nothing innate about trolls being violent. Jane's just a racist asshole. Which, again, is something that has always been a core part of her character. Like, remember that scene in Homestuck where, she acted like this? Dave tells Karkat that he has to run for president and dethrone Jane because only another one of the players could ever hope to beat her in an election. Dave also explains that, in addition to the fascism thing, Jane's neoliberal capitalism would be terrible for the economy. Think about the economy, Karkat! Dave, of course, knows a lot about the economy, because he made a bunch of money on the stock market using time travel while betting against lobotomized crocodiles. Later on, there's a great line where Jane points out that Dave is an unemployed middle school dropout who doesn't actually know anything about economics. Of course, the other joke of that scene is that Jane, herself a high school dropout, thinks that she is qualified to run the economy because she has received several honorary degrees over the years from colleges that she didn't attend. I feel like the economy stuff is meant to be a joke because if it isn't, it's really dumb. Like, Earthsea is a post-scarcity society, and it's unclear how exactly the economy works. Which means I don't care about Jane's vaguely described neoliberal austerity measures. Hell, I honestly don't care about Earthsea in general. Excluding the main cast children, there are, and this isn't me exaggerating, I am being 100% literal, there are 0 new characters introduced in the epilogues. I don't care about this world without history or people. It's less a real planet and more a sandbox for the gods to relax in. Of course, here's a little secret. The election plot doesn't actually matter and is abandoned as soon as it stops being relevant. The point of the election plotline is to cause strife among the main cast, which forces a certain character to reveal their dark side. Karkat is unsure about running for president, so Dave brings up the real reason he wants his boyfriend, to run. For Obama. Remember, the apocalypse happened in 2009, meaning Obama died less than 3 months into his term before he could do anything. And Dave is sure that Obama would have fixed things if he had been given the chance. And of course, we all lived through the 8-year Obama era, where he famously implemented single-payer healthcare, closed Guantanamo Bay, and handed back control of the economy to the working class. Dave demands Karkat do it for Obama because Obama is Jesus. He died for our sins, Karkat! Karkat relents and decides to do it not for Obama but for Dave. Dave comes to the conclusion that, due to Jake's popularity, an endorsement from him will determine the results of the election. Dirk immediately calls and tells Dave no. Dave questions how the hell Dirk knows that Karkat is running seconds after he made that choice. Don't worry about it. Turns out that Dirk is Jane's campaign manager and, being the morally dubious control freak he is the real power behind the throne. Sorta like a secret leader. Put a pin in that. Meanwhile, John gathers up the teenage versions of the main cast. They talk things out at John's house before Homestuck began, and there's a really poignant moment where John thinks about talking to his father, but decides against it. This is the version of John who chose duty over sentimentality. John and the teenage versions of the main cast warp to the land of colors and mayhem. The events of the masterpiece play out, now made out of prose instead of clay. John, Rose, Dave, and Jade are sealed within the ultimate weapon, where they are trapped for quadrillions of years! That's right, they are once again Homestuck. Boo! While trapped, John finally realizes that he is depressed. Eventually, Vriska unleashes the ultimate weapon. Before the heroes can emerge, Vriska is stabbed in the eye with a shard of broken space-time and dragged into the black hole. This is terrible for Vriska, both because she assumes she will die and because she needs to see what happens next. Vriska is a character I like because she's well written, and also kinda hate and want to see bad things happen to her. She's like a wrestling heel, and it is cathartic to see Vriska denied a glimpse at victory. Vriska screaming and flailing like a rag doll as everything she's dedicated her life to is ripped away is a perfect ending to her character. I mean, she's still alive after this moment, but it's a good scene. The heroes emerge and Rose is instantly vaporized by Lord English. Dave swings his sword and misses. Jade attempts to use her first Guardian powers. Unfortunately, they don't work because Homestuck Volume 8 Song 40 by Malcolm Brown and Toby Fox is playing. Jade is impaled by a shard of reality. John attempts to save her, but Jade is dragged beyond the black hole's event horizon. Lord English eats all of John's hammers, for some reason. Dave Pettis shows up and saves John from being bored to death, actual quote, but Lord English still manages to sink his big-ass tooth into John's stomach. Dave stabs Lord English with Calliope, then Lord English bites his head off. The fight ends when Dave Pettis tackles Lord English into the black hole. To John, this doesn't feel like a victory. Well, that fucking sucked. Let's go read Candy instead. In the Candy epilogue, John decides that he doesn't actually give a shit about fighting Lord English. Instead, he decides to stay on Earthsea and enjoy life. He acknowledges that he's made an insubstantial, superficial, and sappy decision, but who gives a shit? I like this choice. This choice is what the ending of Homestuck was all about. I sure hope the dissipation of Canon doesn't make this get weird and off-putting. Roxy is overjoyed that John stays, and the two of them get together. Calliope asks John to go help someone only he can help. Gamzee Makara. It makes sense that Calliope would care about Gamzee. He was the closest thing she ever had to a parent, but also, he's Gamzee. John frees Gamzee from his fridge, something that the younger version of Dirk notices. As soon as Gamzee gets out of the fridge, he announces that he has realized he is a bad person and wants to redeem himself. This redemption is a bit out of left field, considering that at the point in the story John plucked Gamzee from, he was still a very loyal minion of Lord English. Calliope is right that he has suffered. Gamzee's role in the comic is often to be the bad person who gets beaten up for comedy, but that doesn't mean he isn't a violent, murderous bastard. Gamzee explains that actually, his crimes weren't his fault, because he had a stern, neglectful father and had juggalo cultural pressures to murder everyone. And most of the Homestuck cast had neglectful parents, the thing is, Gamzee does have a pretty solid mitigating factor in the original comic. Gamzee only started killing after staring into the eyes of Lil Cal, the evil puppet containing the main antagonist's soul that mind controls people who look at it into being evil. It's ambiguous how much of Gamzee's behavior is because of the puppet, but it almost certainly played a part. You could write a decent redemption for Gamzee Makara, but this very much isn't it. This is Calliope saying he's redeemed, and then Gamzee saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm a good person now, heh heh heh." Dirk realizes immediately that something is astonishingly bad. He calls Jane and orders her to cancel her presidential bid. Jane does as she's told, which is a relief to Karkat on account of the whole potential genocide thing. Meanwhile, Rose's headaches disappear. For Rose at least, the Candy timeline being severed from Canon was a good thing. Doing so cut her off from her seer powers, allowing her to function. Kanaya explains that she had a feeling that a powerful outside force would take Rose away from her. Fortunately, that plot point has been cancelled in this epilogue. Rose and Kanaya reaffirm their love for one another in what is admittedly a touching moment. Later, Rose has a brief spike of pain as she thinks about Dirk and glimpses the meat universe. Rose doesn't worry about it. The new mother grub births the first non-ectobiological troll in 1,000 years, except actually they hatched non-ectobiological trolls 3 years ago, and Hussey just forgot about that. The new grub has asymmetrical horns, and 7 pupils in her left eye. Oh god damn it, no! They made a new Vriska! Why is this a thing that is happening? This is only going to cause problems! Kanaya takes this as a sign that they should adopt the new Vriska. Rose is unsure, because it would be awkward if Vriska ever came back. Kanaya says it's fine, because Vriska is dead, and she has no doubt that they are never ever going to see Vriska again, and admittedly she is right that her and Rose aren't going to see Vriska again, at least until the sequel rolls around. Rose shrugs and decides to go along with it. Now that she isn't running for president, Jane decides to hook up with Jake. He's shooting things while drunk. Jane explains that ever since Dirk told her to cancel her campaign, she's felt like nothing really matters. She decides that she wants to settle down and raise a family. Jake points out, hey, isn't this like when you were mind-controlled and evil and it was really uncomfortable? Jane says she could be a good and loving wife for some eligible bachelor. Jake says good luck on finding someone to impregnate you. As an aside, I didn't like Jake much when I first read Homestuck, but I find myself liking him more and more every time I reread the comic because he is just so fucking stupid. The next time we see Jake, he's waking up after sex that he does not remember because Jane used the trickster lollipop on him. This is, let me check my notes here, yeah, that's rape. Cut to Dave and Karkat's house, where they live as shut-ins. They aren't quite a couple, which admittedly feels realistic. I cannot imagine either of them being mature enough to say, hey, I love you and want a real relationship. Dave makes comics as a hobby, and Karkat spends all of his time getting into fights online with people who don't like Dave's comics. Dave gives a good Dave ramble. Jade, now an adventurous party girl, sometimes lives with them and has a vaguely flirty relationship with both of them. Anyway, Jade offers Dave and Karkat a threesome in an attempt to get them to finally do something in their relationship. Karkat bites her. Jade forces Dave and Karkat to go outside and go on a proper date, and also she's a part of it if they're into that. They aren't into being pushed together and bail. Dave runs into John, who is on his own date with Roxy at a coffee shop, and asks for advice. He explains that he pushed the snooze button on being gay after the end of Homestuck. John tells him to just date Karkat already, but Dave is hesitant, because what about Jade? She has a crush on Dave, but he doesn't love her back, and it feels wrong to leave her after she was forced to spend so much time alone. Dave suggests a polyamorous thing. Then, he decides to talk things through with Dirk, who is famously good at relationships and not the literal worst person to get advice from in this situation. Actually, scratch that. The worst person to get advice from is Gamzee, who is waiting at Dirk's apartment. Dave shoves past him. He doesn't find Dirk. He finds a half-completed feminine robot and a suicide note. Dirk Strider kills himself, the only way he knows how: decapitation. His heart keeps beating until every drop of blood is forced from his corpse. A funeral is held. Dave carries a tiny second coffin for Dirk's head. The main coffin is filled with shitty anime swords. Gamzee drops it because he's the worst. Dave gives the eulogy. He talks about how his bro was an absolute bastard. He says that Dirk struggled with the idea that he was cosmically fated to be evil. Dave speculates that Dirk was struggling and decided to kill himself because it was the only way to keep himself from eventually hurting Jane, Jake, and Roxy because he loved them. Dave says he looked up to Dirk in a way he could never look up to his bro. It's a great eulogy, but Dave is wrong about why Dirk killed himself. He's wrong about a lot of things regarding Dirk. Rose is about to give a speech when Lay Sign, Gamzee marches up to the podium. Gamzee gives a terrible, terrible eulogy, eliciting heckles from Carcat. The thing is, Gamzee was the last person to talk to Dirk before he died, and I hate to say it, but he understands Dirk better than most people. He says Dirk was born with a purpose, a plan, but the wicked ways of this world stole that away from him. At the funeral, John offers to use his retcon powers to go and save Dirk. Dave is disgusted because doing so would deny Dirk his personal autonomy. After the funeral, Roxy asks John to marry her. John says sure, and Roxy says that they're going to be so freaking happy. At the wedding, Jane forces Jake to try and catch the bouquet, but Jade catches it first. Jade makes a joke about tying the knot, and John doesn't get it, but Terezi does for some reason? Why do Alien know what Omegaverse is? How do Alien know what Omegaverse is? Why do Alien both know what Omegaverse is, and also somehow not know what marriage is? If you are as confused as John is, that's because this joke foreshadows something that happened in Homestuck 2. 3 months later, Roxy is preggers. John and Roxy hang out with Kanaya and Rose, and it's mentioned that Rose breastfeeds Vriska Jr., and this raises so many questions about troll biology. Also, if you're questioning why Rose is lactating, the answer is I don't know. I mean, there's that thing that we're not talking about right now, but that shouldn't have happened yet. Kanaya mentions that she thinks humans are born via chestburster, which she heard from Carcat, who was told it by Dave. Meanwhile, Jane rants to Gamzee about how they need to regulate troll reproduction. Gamzee complains about the man keeping his people down, and let's talk about racial coding, a topic I am the most qualified to talk about. Racial coding is when a character isn't a specific race, but is very clearly meant to be that race. Like, take Garnet from Steven Universe. Garnet isn't technically black, she's a rock alien hologram, but she has a darker skin tone, an afro, and is played by a black actress. The viewer assumes Garnet is black, as the show's writers intended. And that example is fine, but sometimes racial coding takes the form of the Nemoidians, the evil, traitorous, bug-eyed aliens who have exaggerated Chinese accents, or Watto, the evil, greedy, hook-nosed slave trader from the desert. The Star Wars prequels, haven't aged very well. And those are the Star Wars movies that aren't fan fiction. Anyway, there is a Homestuck character who is clearly intended to be read as black, and that character is Mina Pikesies. Mina has a stereotypically black hairstyle and talks like a black teenager, or at least what a white webcomic writer in their 30s thinks black teenagers talk like. Also Gamzee. Gamzee comes off as a negative black stereotype to a lot of readers, with his use of African-American vernacular English, interest in rap music, practice of voodoo, and drug addiction. And to give Andrew Hussey the smallest amount of undeserved benefit of the doubt, I don't actually think Gamzee was intended to come off as black. Gamzee is very clearly a parody of Juggalos, fans of the Insane Clown Posse, a pair of white rappers who deliberately talk in a very stereotypically black manner. But here's the problem with that. When you make a character who is mocking white people who talk with affected black mannerisms, it is almost indistinguishable from mocking actual black people, because Gamzee is a gray alien! Anyway, Gamzee never really came across as black to me until I read the Epilogues, which really ramped up the vaguely black coding, what with him talking about his dad not being around, complaining about the man, and All of the cuckolding. I think the thing that really clenched it is the fact that Gamzee keeps saying the N-word. I mean, he says ninja, as in what Naruto Uzumaki is, but I mean, when the character who already feels black-coded starts calling the minority group he is a part of my ninjas, it is very clear what word is being swapped out. Apparently this is a real thing juggalos do. According to the first thing that came up when I googled this, it's because the Insane Clown Posse think ninjas are really cool and honorable, and sure, that's the reason, I bet. Anyway, the black coding feels especially strong in the epilogues, and I wish it didn't exist. This is the biggest problem I have with the epilogues. Like other problems with the epilogues, I can see the reasoning for the writing decision, but this is just off-putting and leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Like, maybe Gamzee is acting like a black caricature on purpose to fuck with people. That's a thing he would do, but it just comes across as really racist. Gamzee calls Jane xenophobic. She gets pissed and thinks that he's trying to get a rise out of her to put her into a certain mood. Gamzee says Jane is going to get cancelled. Jane calls him a literal insect and mocks him for being addicted to drugs, even though he canonically hasn't been addicted to drugs for years. Oh, while we're talking about why Gamzee is a shitty character, he's also a bad portrayal of addiction and mental illness. Gamzee says that he wants to suck on Jane's big milk-filled titties, and the two start fucking. It is then revealed that Jake is sitting on the same couch as them as this happens, holding his and Jane's newborn baby, Tavros Crocker. The scene is incredibly off-putting, but the reveal that Jake is just there is funny. Jake calls Jade, and she talks about how monogamy is lame. Jade says she also wants a child, but can't have one with Dave because something that was explained in Homestuck too. Jade mentions she's talked to Rose about Rose being a surrogate, and I sure hope this plot point doesn't go somewhere stupid. Jake says that they're all drifting apart, and how he just wanted to talk like old times. Being Jake is suffering. Oh, and before I forget, this scene is statutory rape because Gamzee is still 16. Jade suggests adopting a child to Karkat and Dave. Karkat explains that they couldn't adopt a child if he was involved because of the anti-interspecies adoption laws, which didn't stop Rose from adopting Vriska because, shut up. Dave rambles about microwaving babies, which is his way of explaining that he doesn't want to be a dad. Guess Jade won't get that kid she wants. Oh, come on, I just got done incrementing that. The trio talk about how Jake is stuck in an abusive relationship with a rapist. Then a corpse falls from the sky? Teenage Jade's corpse from the fight against Lord English in the Meat Epilogue. They take the body to Jane, who is unable to revive her. The group gathers to discuss this. Roxy suggests having another funeral because the last time they were all together was Dirk's funeral. You know, they've all been so busy with politics and breeding trolls. Kanai says they shouldn't talk about those topics and that there's a reason they don't all hang out very often. Roxy says politics should never get between friends, which sets Karkat off. Karkat rants about Jane being racist. Everyone, including fucking Gamzee, tries to calm him down. Karkat yells that he still has nightmares about Gamzee and wants nothing to do with him. Roxy and Jane tell him to lay off because Gamzee is trying really hard on his redemption arc. Gamzee honks, and Karkat says fuck you to everyone, including Dave. Karkat leaves the group. At the second funeral, which no one but Roxy gives a shit about, Calliope explains that, while death is terrifying, there is joy in how it makes us fall in love with the important people in our lives all over again. Aradia and Solix show up because Aradia likes corpse parties. Karkat questions how the hell they're even there, and they just shrug. Like, I guess Aradia must have fallen into the black hole after the rapture, but I don't know how Solix got there then. Aradia talks to Gamzee and says it's so nice he thinks he and Jane have a real relationship. Aradia asks to see the corpse. Living Jade is disturbed, but Dave says it's fine because nothing really matters. Roxy says that she wouldn't have had the courage to marry John if Dirk hadn't died, and says that things would be really different in the Meat Epilogue. I mean, if Dirk was still alive. Mid-eulogy, Roxy goes into labor. Also, the corpse gets up. The corpse says that she isn't Jade. Calliope asks who she is, and, with candy red text, the corpse says that Calliope knows who she is. They met once, years ago, when they were both dead. Calliope runs away screaming. Aradia says this is one of the best funerals she's ever been to. Solk says top 5 at least. The reanimated corpse says that she expected this all to happen and is exactly where she is meant to be. She introduces herself. Calliope, the muse of space. She has possessed dead teen Jade's body to protect their world. John and Roxy's son is born, and they name him Harry Anderson after that guy from Night Court. Cracks appear in the sky, dumping out more ghosts from the fight against English. Gamzee becomes a cult leader and starts teaching people in his ways of redemption. Eridan's ghost apologizes to Pfeffery. She accepts his apology, and Gamzee makes her kiss Eridan. This feels hollow and gross. Speaking of gross, John comes to the conclusion that Gamzee is molesting Tavros Jr. Tav reassures him that Gamzee isn't molesting him, although that does seem like the type of thing that would happen to this poor kid. No, he's just training Tav, like how Dirk trained Dave, and actually wait, that's still really bad. John is so disgusted, he leaves the group, separates from Roxy, and abandons his son. Meanwhile, Aradia and Solix begin serving the Muse. Muse Calliope frequently goes into trances to protect the Candy timeline. She explains that it is her duty to defend the innocent from destruction, degradation, and disillusion. And by golly, she sure is doing a bang-up job at keeping beloved characters from being degraded. The Muse explains that the people of the Candy timeline are actually the lucky ones because they are beyond the influence of the prince. She explains that her work will not be finished until she is able to deal with the prince personally. Jane becomes more authoritarian and orders Jake to host a reality TV show where political prisoners are forced to dance and sent to work camps if they lose. Karkat starts a rebellion against Jane. He is aided in this rebellion by Swiffer Eggmop, who is named Swiffer Eggmop, and by Mina, who is alive again because of something that happened in Meat. Actually, wait, how do ghosts work in the epilogues? Because Eridan and Pfeffery are still ghosts, which means the Mina being alive doesn't actually matter because ghosts are just allowed to walk around, I guess? Karkat orders Mina to stop making fish puns. 10 years later, teenagers Harry Anderson Egbert and Vriska Mariam Lalonde are dating, which is weird because he's technically her uncle. They talk about joining the rebellion. Solix says who cares. Dave and Jade get married even though Dave is still pining for Karkat. Karkat goes to war with Jane. Mr. Crocker dies saving Jane's unnamed president puppet from an assassination. Jane does not take it well. Jake tries to console her, but Jane wants Karkat's head. Gamzee calls her xenophobic, but Jane isn't in the mood and orders her men to toss him off the battleship. Then Gamzee fucks a teenager, and you know what? I think I'm gonna take a break from Candy for a bit. Candy is rough. It is a chore to read through. It is the source of most people's complaints about the epilogues, and, full disclosure, I agree that Meat is better. That said, the past 3,000 words of this essay have been a bit dishonest. I have left out events pertaining to a few key characters, most notably, the entire arc of John Egbert, which is disingenuous given the fact that he is the main protagonist of Candy, who the entire story revolves around. But then again, that shouldn't be too surprising, given the fact that people don't really talk about John's arc in Candy. Over the years, I've read endless complaints over the weird, fucked up things that happen in the epilogues, but never once read a single person discuss what happens to John in Candy. And that is a shame, because Candy John's arc is actually really well written. John's arc in Candy is written well enough that it almost makes Candy a good story. But you'll notice I said almost. Because even if Candy has a few incredible, well-written moments, those moments hinge on the rest of the Candy epilogue being terrible. I did not enjoy rereading most of Candy. But I loved rereading Meat. When we last left Dirk, he had just finished having a phone call with Dave about the election. Said phone call was made during the middle of a pro wrestling match against Jake, leading to boos and thrown diapers from the audience. According to the narration, Jake thinks to himself that Dirk is magnificent, and that he wishes Dirk would be nicer, but then again, he wouldn't be Dirk then. Dirk takes a second phone call in the middle of the match, this one from Rose. Rose explains to Dirk that she is very, very sick because she is ascending. She is becoming her ultimate self. This idea was first introduced by Dave Petta back in Homestuck proper, who explained to Jade that every timeline, even the ones that she doesn't remember, helps shape Jade as a character. This is weird and metatextual, but things that happen in alternate timelines are still important because they contribute to who characters are to the reader. Like Rose's alcoholism and her death saving Roxy in the pre-retcon timeline did not happen to the version of Rose who was talking to Dirk, but they still happened, and they shaped who Rose is as a character. Or to give an example from the epilogues, the John who battles Lord English and the John who marries Roxy are both John Egbert. The Dirk who kills himself and the Dirk who does all of the horrible things he does in the Meat timeline, and the Dirk who raised Dave are all Dirk, and understanding one timeline's version of a character helps you understand the nuances of every version of the character. An ultimate self is a version of a character who possesses all of the memories from every single timeline, a coalescing of everything that the reader knows about them, becoming a metaphysical god in the process. Dave Petta understood this shit because of their heart, time, and sprite powers. They also warned that becoming an ultimate self would destroy anyone with a physical body. Also, this is the first time I noticed that the page Dave Petta and Jade kiss is the boob page. Anyway, like Dave Petta warned, Rose is dying because she is becoming an ultimate. Dirk shrugs and says same. He has already gone ultimate. Except, unlike Rose, Dirk has adapted to his new power. His shattered consciousness has reformed into a single entity existing on a higher plane of reality. Dirk says that he has a solution for Rose that will allow her to become her ultimate self without dying. Dirk also mentions that he is controlling the election and that the wheels of reality need a caretaker, someone to grease the mechanism and keep things running. Rose says that it must be a burden to be the sole machinist of reality itself. Dirk admits it's a curse, but somebody's got to do it. Meanwhile, Jane finds out about Karkat running for president. She realizes, just as Dave did, that Jake English's endorsement will swing the election. She calls, and Jake is happy that she called out of the blue without any ulterior motives. Jake is a treasure. I hope this timeline treats him right. I say, pretending for a moment that I don't know what's coming. Jane invites Jake over to drink with her. Except, this time, Jane's attempts to seduce him fail because, according to the narration, Jake can't stop thinking about Dirk. Dirk calls, somehow knowing about what just happened, and tells Jane to leave Jake to him. Meanwhile, Dave talks political strategy with Jade and Karkat. He brings up that Jane will probably bring up how horrible Alternia was and how the trolls ate babies. Karkat responds that they only ate the defective ones. Jade asks to talk about the relationship. Dave and Karkat very much do not want to have that conversation. Jade takes a shot in the dark and asks if the reason Dave won't fuck her is because he is in love with President Barack Obama, or alternatively, Jesus. Dave says that Jesus isn't real. Jade asks if Obama was real or if he was a fictional character, like Snoop Dogg or Nicolas Cage. As a reminder, Jade grew up on an island and was raised by a dog. But yes, Obama is real, and also canonically, he is Jade's nephew. Hey, remember that time Andrew Hussey revealed that Jake was Obama's grandfather? And that the reason for the birther stuff wasn't because conservatives are fucking racist, but because he actually didn't have a birth certificate, because he was an interdimensional traveler. This was revealed in Skynet Systems Incorporated, a really shitty ARG that revealed that a bunch of random people Hussey is obsessed with are related to John, for some reason, including the guy from Night Court. Also, one of the guys from the Insane Clown Posse is the brother of Guy Fieri and the ecto-son of Oliver Hardy and Jesse James, while the other one is the ecto-son of Stan Laurel and Adolf Hitler? What? Also, Steve Bannon is a failed clone of Guy Fieri, apparently? Here's the official family tree. People usually don't talk about that bit of the Homestuck franchise, probably because it said that the Holocaust happened because a Jewish person was mean to Hitler once, and yikes! I know it's an attempt at a joke, but it isn't funny, and it's just so fucking disrespectful. This is the worst thing Hussey ever wrote. Back to the epilogues. Jade tries drawing a shipping grid. Karkat tells her to cease and desist. Dave says it isn't happening, and Jade leaves. Dave and Karkat play Troll Tony Hawk. Rose comes to Dirk's workshop. She brings up the complacency of the learned, that wizard book she wrote that Calliope and Hussey cosplay as the main character of. She says that the version she wrote as a child was better than the B2 adult written version because it meant something and contained more of her emotion. She recaps that in the wizard fic, 12 wizard children revolt against kind but complacent older wizards and go on to commit atrocities after being corrupted by knowledge never meant for mortal minds to grasp. Rose speculates that her writing was influenced by her latent seer powers. She used to think that the 12 wizards were representatives of the trolls, but of course, symbolism in Homestuck is malleable and shifts based on circumstances. 12 players walk through the door to Earthsea at the end of Homestuck. John, Rose, Dave, Jade, Karkat, Kanaya, Terezi, Jane, Jake, Dirk, Roxy, and Calliope. Also Mr. Crocker, the mayor, and PM, but they don't count. In the complacency of the learned, all 12 succumb to the light of knowledge, becoming insane or evil. They went ultimate. Except only Dirk and Rose are turning ultimate. Why? Dirk speculates that maybe it's because the others haven't used their powers, or maybe because Rose and Dirk's powers specifically make them susceptible to ascension. Rose says that Terezi was right to leave Earth-C. Rose tries to get up. Dirk doesn't help her, and the narration says she prefers it this way, and also that despite her marriage to Kanaya, Rose likes being solitary. Rose asks again how Dirk is fine, and he says he's kinda going crazy, although the narration notes that he doesn't actually believe this. Dirk says it's because he has experience multitasking with his subconscious. Rose says that she could let go and fully ascend, let go of all that pain, but is afraid that if she does, she won't be herself anymore. Dirk pulls off his sunglasses and gazes into Rose's eyes. He says that he's scared of himself. He's brilliant. Things work out for the best when he's in control, but there's something unsettling about it. Rose says that her power is putting distance between her and everyone else. Everyone but Dirk, that is. Rose repeats Dirk's metaphor about how he keeps the mechanism that is reality running smoothly. The narration notes that Rose is beginning to talk like Dirk. But does it really matter? They're kindred spirits, both puppet masters. But you already knew that, right? The moment when the narration text turns orange and the reader realizes that all along Dirk has been the narrator of Meat is the defining twist of the epilogues and a good contender for the single best moment in any of the sequels to Homestuck. The twist is foreshadowed. Notice how the narration kept praising Dirk and how Dirk knew about Karkat's campaign the moment it began. The narrator changing isn't something new for Homestuck. Doc Scratch and Caliborn both took over for stretches of the original comic. Caliborn in particular uses narrator powers to transform the comic into a spite-fueled parody. This is also not something new for Dirk. During Act 6-2, Your Shit Is Fucked from the original Homestuck, Jane glances at a copy of the book Pony Pals, Detective Pony by Jeanne Betancourt, which by the way is an actual book. I assumed it was something Hussey made up, but no, it's real. Dirk crossed out the text of the original saccharine children's book, replacing it with his own orange text, changing the book into a crass parody. There's a bit earlier in Meat where John says that people don't really change, they just grow up, and unfortunately, that is true about Dirk. Dirk addresses the reader directly, pointing out that the you the narration refers to isn't really any specific person and can be transferred to another character, like John Egbert, for example. Dirk makes his contempt for John clear, saying that John isn't special. He's a boring loser, unremarkable in his unremarkableness, useful only as a pawn. He also makes his contempt for Vriska clear, saying he placed focus on her only so he could dismiss her, a vainglorious spotlight hog from the narrative forever. Good riddance. Here's the kind of terrifying thing about Dirk. He isn't just narrating what happens. It becomes clearer and clearer as the Meat epilogue goes on that Dirk is actually controlling what happens. He isn't just a narrator, he's a reality-warping puppet master, and every other character is a puppet for him to control. And looking back on how the fight against Lord English went, I have to ask, is Dirk the reason it ended so poorly? His narration heavily implies that Vriska getting yeeted into a black hole was his doing, and it would make sense for Dirk to manipulate things so that everyone, especially John Egbert, dies horribly. That way, they aren't around to interfere with his machinations. Dirk narrates John waking up, and right away, John notices that something is off. Dirk narrates that John looks like shit. John apologizes, and Dirk pretends he doesn't know who John's talking to. Dirk narrates that it's all John's fault, and he feels bad. Dirk explains that everyone had to die for the functional necessity of the ending. John notices that his thoughts don't sound like his own. Because, of course, they aren't. They're Dirk's narration. As the narrator, Dirk has the ability to control people by dictating their thoughts. This did happen a bit in Homestuck. The commands written by the exiles and the comic's readers appeared as voices in the heads of the main cast. For example, after Bro's death, Dave heard the aimless renegade's commands to go fight Jack. But Dirk's narration seems to be even more potent, and he's been using it for a while now. Think back to Rose's decision to trust Dirk, or Jake's freak out about dating someone other than Dirk. Those scenes were likely Dirk mind-controlling them. Except, John is aware that he isn't hearing his own thoughts. Rose, Kanaya, Jake, they're all susceptible to Dirk's control, but John is aware instantly that something is wrong. Dave and Jane also briefly notice something is off later on, but not nearly as fast as John, maybe because of his retcon powers, maybe because of his class spec, maybe because he's the main character, but for whatever reason, John is resistant to Dirk's control. He is much more remarkable than Dirk gives him credit. Dirk ditches John and cuts to the B-plot, where Jade is pitching politics to Roxy and Calliope. Roxy says that they don't really care about politics and don't want to hurt the feelings of their best friend. Dirk narrates that the inner machinations of Roxy's mind are an enigma due to their void powers. It's like Roxy's thoughts don't even exist. Hey, stop treating Roxy like the fans do. Roxy is a smart scientist and a complex character. It is ridiculous that they are constantly demeaned and looked down upon by fans and, as we'll see, the protagonists of both epilogues. Calliope also says that they don't want to get involved. If you've noticed some theys, that's because Roxy and Calliope both decide to come out as non-binary. Dirk is shocked by this, but he decides he doesn't actually have a problem with it, and says that it's insulting that anyone would imagine that he would have a problem with it. He says he will allow it, and wow! That is a very telling way to phrase things. Calliope explains that they thought of themselves as a girl, only in contrast to Caliborn's toxic masculinity, which doesn't really matter anymore. Roxy explains that gender is lame and that they went along with heavy amounts of femininity because they were the last quote-unquote girl on the planet and felt responsible for hooking up with Dirk and continuing the species and yada yada yada. But on Earth-C, none of these constraints exist anymore, so Roxy has the freedom to explore who they really are. Also, Dirk misgenders Calliope in the narration, but apologizes after. And I mean, that's an accidental misspeaking, and surely not something that will become a pattern. Wow, double always sunny. Comedy conventions dictate that I must now eventually use that gag for a third time. As they are explaining politics to Jade, she collapses. She has a dream of the teenage Jade who fought Lord English, of being dragged into the black hole. Come, the narration commands, text now red and uncapitalized. Dirk says, "What the fuck?" as he realizes the cherub is making her move. Karkat and Dave go to meet with Kanaya. Kanaya is on board because Jane has the potential for despotism, just like the most evil Homestuck character, Pfeffery. She looks nice, but remember what she did to those cuttlefish? She cold them! She cold them, Karkat! Kanaya says they must work to have dignity for all species. Dirk narrates that morality is a cultural construct, and yeah, that is a justification he would use. Dave asks about Rose, calling the ship between Rose and Kanaya Rosemary. Kanaya says that she hates the ship name and calls her wife. Dirk answers and says that Rose can't come to the phone right now before putting Kanaya on hold so he can deal with John. Kanaya doesn't react well. Dirk narrates that Kanaya should just chill out because he has everything under control. Dirk monologues that, given his newfound powers, why shouldn't he become a capital G god? John complains about being made to think this bullshit. John runs into Mina and does not remember her name. She doesn't remember his name either, and guesses that it is Joke. And hey, Joke is John's biological father. Jake. His name is Jake. Mina steals the Ring of Life from John and is transported to the Candy Epilogue. By the way, John stole the Ring of Life from Arena earlier, and I skipped that part to make the script flow better. John is sitting there bleeding out when an old friend shows up. Let's put a pin in this plot point. Dirk lets Kanaya off hold and explains that he isn't up to anything sinister. Kanaya sees through his bullshit. Dirk admits in his narration that he's fucking with Kanaya. He says that Kanaya loves Rose, but that isn't enough. Dirk understands Rose. Dirk hangs up and lies to Rose that he was talking to a telemarketer. Dirk and Rose ramble off half-remembered Wikipedia philosophy, which eventually turns to the concept of free will. Dirk speculates that free will isn't real. Rose says that she thinks it exists, and Dirk asks her to stand up. She tries, but can't, because that would require Dirk narrating that she stands up, and Dirk won't let her. Dirk helps Rose see into the ruins of the battle against Lord English. Rose is saddened that John is dying because he did what she told him to do. Rose says that he could have made a different choice, and Dirk shows her the candy timeline. Rose isn't sure if it's better or worse than meat. She speculates that reality is unraveling. One universe too much blood, the other too much sugar, a process accelerated when John made his choice. Dirk monologues that Rose is his daughter, his equal, his mirror. He wants her to serve at his side. He says that she feels the same way and just needs a little nudge in the right direction. Dirk uses his reality warping powers to guide Rose to the precipice of becoming ultimate. She's worried that if she does, she won't be herself anymore. Who gives a fuck? Dirk says. She'll be better. Rose lets go. Her body dies, but Dirk keeps her alive. Dirk narrates that Rose looks up at him with adoration, that he is as bright to her as the green sun. Dirk boasts that the truth belongs to him, and now so does Rose. I don't think Rose would have made this choice without Dirk manipulating her thoughts. It's possible. Rose has a history of endangering herself for power and knowledge, but I think that Rose would be too hesitant to make that choice, which is why Dirk had to make it for her. I certainly don't think Rose would have made a choice that, as we'll see, means leaving Kanaya forever without first saying goodbye. She is like her father in many ways, but there are still cruelties that Rose would never be a part of. Meanwhile, teenage Jade is still being dragged into the black hole. Dirk attempts to manipulate Jade into turning back, but Jade ignores him. Dirk puts his foot down and narrates that Jade will not go into the black hole. She does not want to see what happens when she unsettles the spirit resting inside. She does, though, says the new red narration. Dirk narrates that Jade wants to run away, that she doesn't want to die, but the red narration says that Jade wants to return to her. Dirk shouts that Jade can turn back, that she can find John and come to Earthsea, that it isn't too late. But it is too late. Jade closes her eyes and lets go. Alternate Calliope has found her new body, one she will wear from her new home on Earthsea. By the way, while I was editing this, Beyond Canon finally gave alternate Calliope her own name, Al. Originally my script just called her the Muse, but now I'll call her Al, I guess. Ugh, that name is a lot less intimidating. Can't wait for her to beat Dirk using Polka. Al's possession of teenage Jade allows her, through vague plot reasons, to reach in to meet Jade. She uses this connection to steal Dirk's role as narrator. Dirk's narration text still pops up, but Al is in control. Meet Jade ends up trapped in a trance while under Al's control. She explains that she has taken control of Meat to mitigate the corrosive effect of a megalomaniac prince who represents a threat both to the continued existence of the Meat world and to life itself. Dirk complains and now makes his text tiny. Non-God Calliope sees Al possess Jade, realizes what's going on, and runs the fuck away. Al explains that she has important work to do and, to accomplish that work, must keep Dirk at bay. Dirk complains that some self-important ass with virtually no exposure to human culture, emotion, or values thinks she knows best because Dirk doesn't actually understand irony that well. He also says that he was just having a little fun as narrator. I'll remind you that a few pages ago, he mind-controlled his daughter into committing suicide so her ghost could help with his evil plan. Al explains that Dirk's narrator powers have weaknesses due to Dirk's inability to relate to other people's experiences. She says that he's still that boy in the middle of the ocean, seeing a horizon that he will never reach. She waxes philosophically that, unlike Dirk, she has crossed her horizons and that Dirk is scared of loneliness, while she understands that children left alone are those who most despair at being ignored. Wait, is that why Caliborn was the way he was? Because he grew up alone? He became obsessed with being the center of attention? Maybe, but I wouldn't read too deep into this, because this is just Al's opinion, not an objective fact, and a ton of Homestuck characters grew up alone without becoming assholes. Dirk bitches that he hates Al, that she's boring, and that he'll make her pay. I assume because of the tiny text that he sounds like an angry chipmunk. Let's get back to politics. Jane campaigns using the trickster lollipop because it makes her more charismatic and also Caucasian, which is problematic. Jane snaps that it isn't problematic before realizing that she's arguing with no one. Side note, a lot of people have argued that the Epilogues made Jane into a Trump analog, and if she was intended to be a Trump parody, she's a bad one. The comparisons don't really stretch any further than they're both rich, racist authoritarians, but the thing is, Trump is openly proud of his bigotry, while Jane tries to cover it up with civility and talk of equity. She feels, to me at least, more like one of those polite centrists who deep down hold racist beliefs and are hostile to any attacks on capitalism than she does to an openly white supremacist populist like Trump. I mean, maybe Andrew Hussey is just really, really shallow politically, and actually now that I look back at the Skynet ARG, yeah, they are. Dirk calls and says that she needs to handle Jake because he can't anymore. Al says Dirk does not react well to his plans being interfered with, and compares him to Caliborn, which pisses Dirk off. Jane decides to launch a preemptive smear campaign against Jake. In his workshop, Dirk puts together a rifle. Despite apparent attempts to hide this, Al notices with her omniscience. Dirk takes a practice shot and boasts that Jake's ass is his. Karkat and Dave go mountain climbing with Jake and explain the problems with Jane becoming president. That she's a privileged asshat, more concerned with how things look than how they are, and that she sets a bad precedent. Al narrates that Jake, now free from Dirk, decides to assert his independence by endorsing Karkat. While Dave is setting up the event where Jake will endorse Karkat, Roxy calls to tell him about Jade's condition. Al notes how diverse the crowd is, and Dirk bitches about fake wokeness. Since when did Dirk become a failed clone of Guy Fieri? Unable to interfere in any other way, Dirk texts Roxy, telling them to give Jade lots of sunlight. Roxy is weirded out, but opens the curtains. Al narrates that Roxy is uneasy about Jake's endorsement because they aren't sure if they should be involved with the politics of the world they made. I'm not sure if Al is actually able to read Roxy's thoughts or is just guessing. Dirk misgenders Roxy, and Al tells him to be respectful. This time, Dirk doesn't apologize. So, this is a controversial part of the epilogues. Dirk is a bit transphobic, and that is off-putting to a lot of people. To be fair, there was a content warning. We were warned about the content. Dirk is the villain. He's supposed to be a bad person, just like how the main villain of Homestuck was misogynistic to make him come across as more vile. Dirk is right that him mentally misgendering Roxy is a much smaller act of cruelty than what he does to his other loved ones, but still, this hits a lot closer to home for a lot of people. A lot more Homestuck fans have had to deal with their childhood friends not accepting them for being queer than have had to deal with their estranged father mind-controlling them into becoming a god. If I were to justify this from a writing perspective, it's to show how Dirk treats his loved ones. Not as people with internal lives, but as pawns for him to manipulate. He cares about Roxy, but when they start acting in a way he didn't plan for, he doesn't acknowledge it. He wasn't the one to decide Roxy would be non-binary, so why would he respect that aspect of them? Or maybe he's just a transphobic asshole. When Roxy comes out, Dirk says that Jade would have probably gone by they as a teen, kind of implying that he sees it as a Zoomer fad and doesn't actually think non-binary people are valid. Also, maybe Jade would have. Jade's gender identity is kind of complicated. Hit the counter. But the would have loved it as a teenager thing feels condescending. Later in Meet, Roxy, much like the best Dragon Ball Super antagonist, begins going by he/him pronouns. Dirk constantly and remorselessly misgenders him again and again while insisting that he still cares about him. Terezi yells at him to stop being transphobic, and Dirk pretends that he's just a dumb guy who doesn't remember things that were just explained to him, and that's why he's misgendering someone who is supposed to be his fucking friend. Al narrates that Roxy loves Meet Calliope and that they are beautiful and should be told that fact every day. Dirk laughs at this, and to be clear, Al is every bit as petty and immature as Dirk is. At least she isn't transphobic, though. Actually, it's interesting that Al seems to go by she, her. She doesn't mind being called she by other characters, and the narration of Candy, which seems to be written either by her or at the very least by someone who isn't transphobic, constantly calls her her. I guess this makes sense. This is the version of Calliope who beat her brother. Loser Calliope says they only cared about gender in opposition to Caliborn, and Al was defined by opposing Caliborn. Al's dialogue is also usually written as being spoken by Jade, so maybe that's part of it. Jade identifies as female, and Al is trying to be Jade. It can get complicated talking about characters who go by different pronouns in different universes. I'm using whatever pronoun they are currently using in the story at that point in time, and using they when talking about them in general, which I think is the most respectful way to approach this. Dave is about to say he loves Karkat, but doesn't go through with it. Dirk complains that he's surrounded by pussies. Gotta love that toxic masculinity. Roxy asks Dave how to come out to your friends. Dirk whines that Dave needs his guidance. Dave gives, let's call it advice. Al narrates that Dave likes Karkat more than anyone else in the world and would spend forever with him in any type of relationship. Dirk calls this endless floundering incel limbo an atrocity, too cruel for even him. Al narrates Roxy's thoughts on gender, and Dirk calls it invasive. Dirk yells at Al, saying that his friends aren't puppets for her to toy around with. They're Dirk's puppets, and it's about time he took them back. Dirk climbs the bell tower, holding his rifle. Al narrates that Dirk's legs get tired, but Dirk points out that he can fly. This is the beginning of an excellent fight. Dirk versus the narrator. She controls everything, but he's smart enough to counter her at every blow. Al drops a bell on Dirk, and he cuts through it with his katana. Dirk reaches the top and takes aim, but Al has Dave notice and save Karkat. In doing so, Dave dives in front of Jake, blocking Dirk's shot. Al narrates that Dirk would never kill Dave. Dirk says she's right about that, but not about a few other things. First, the gun is loaded with tranquilizers. Second, Jake isn't the target. Dirk swings the gun around, aiming at Roxy's apartment where Jade is standing, in front of a window, the curtains of which have been pulled away by Roxy. Al narrates that Dirk's finger cramps, but it's fine. The gun is voice activated. Dirk shouts fire. The tranq dart breaks through the window, hits Jade, and puts her to sleep. Al fades from the narration, using her last words to warn that she is coming for Dirk. Dirk says he's sick of the toothache Al brought. Who's hungry for some meat? Dirk says that Jake is a dumb asshole who makes everything lamer, but somehow also makes everyone want to fuck him. It's because he's whimsical. It attracts the hoes. Dirk makes it clear that he no longer holds any affection for Jake. He narrates that Jake feels nervous, forcing Jake to think he's made a mistake. Dirk tears into Jake, saying he betrayed Jane, saying that Jake pretends to be stupid to make people like him, that Jake wants to be taken advantage of. Dirk continues angrily dictating Jake's thoughts, writing that Jake loves him and wants to submit because to love Dirk is to obey him. Jake, after having his mind torn apart and rewritten by his ex, shouts that he loves Dirk. With Jake dealt with, Jane easily wins the election, just as Dirk planned, for some reason. The reason Dirk needed Jane to be elected isn't actually stated, although I have a few theories, but because it isn't said in the actual book, it just makes all of this feel pointless. Dirk meets with Jake later in Meet, and it is clear that Dirk has done permanent damage. He broke Jake's brain, leaving him unable to think about anything else but his devotion to Dirk. Dirk doesn't give a shit. He has Jake give him a spaceship so he can leave the Meat world and move on to his next scheme. Jake asks to come along. Dirk says he can't. Jake asks when Dirk will return, and Dirk says he isn't coming back, ever. Jake says he can't live without Dirk, and Dirk orders Jake to serve Jane and give her heirs, all of whom will eventually die because they aren't gods like Jake. Jake calls this dreadful and begs Dirk to take him with him. Dirk kisses Jake, then abandons him, vowing to never let Jake English break his heart again. Seems someone didn't take their breakup very well. While we're on the topic of relationships, Dirk decides to fix Dave and Karkat's relationship before leaving. He narrates them getting together, except Dave is hesitant, much to Dirk's annoyance. Dave resists Dirk's control. Dave loves Karkat, that much is clear, but he can tell something is wrong, that someone else is writing his thoughts. Dirk narrates that Dave takes off his shades and leans in to kiss Karkat. Dave shouts to get the fuck out of his head and let him do it himself. Dave finally kisses Karkat, and it's a nice moment, but Dirk's presence gives it a dark undertone. Even if Dirk is pushing people to do things they want, the fact that he accomplishes this through invasive mind control is really fucked up. There's one more relationship for Dirk to fuck with. Dirk has brainwashed Rose into serving him, something that Rose's wife understandably has a problem with. Rose and Dirk stop by Rose's apartment so Rose can grab a few mementos, including a necklace Kanaya gave her. Dirk doesn't give a shit because the 7 years spent on Earthsea are irrelevant. Rose asks if Kanaya will be okay with her leaving, and Dirk says she's too sick to worry about that. Let him handle it. He'll make Kanaya understand that this is the best thing for everybody. Dirk narrates that Kanaya realizes that she's in the wrong, that Rose belongs with Dirk because she isn't good enough. She wants Rose to be happy, and Rose is happy with Dirk. Dirk forces Kanaya to call Rose and say goodbye. Rosemary is dead, thanks to Dirk. Somebody needs to chop this fucker's head off right fucking now. Meat is generally considered to be the better of the two epilogues, a sentiment I agree with. I respect Candy as a story, and I think there are a lot of good ideas brought up by it, more on that in a minute, but it is a slog to get through. But Meat is a genuinely excellent story. It reshapes Dirk Strider into this complex and menacing monster while, at least in my opinion, still having him feel like Dirk. Dirk is a terrifying villain who makes my skin crawl. Homestuck was a story that a lot of people liked for a lot of different reasons. For the amazing animations, the excellent dialogue, the complex characters, the genuinely hilarious moments, the big dramatic shifts, but an aspect of Homestuck that I love, that I think Andrew Hussey liked more than any other aspect, despite the apathy a lot of fans showed towards it, is the metatextual nature of the comic. Homestuck is, ultimately, a comic about the fact that it is a comic. It is filled with these interesting postmodern scenes playing around with the medium to tell a truly unique story. And Meat is a continuation of the metatextual nature of Homestuck. As I said, Dirk's megalomaniacal narrator rants are a continuation of Doc Scratch and Caliborn's stints as narrator. But Meat goes further, exploring the idea that a narrator controls the story, showing that free will cannot exist in a story, not when a spiteful author is in control. Dirk is given ultimate power, and it instantly goes to his head. His need for control and his deep-seated cruelty are shown in dramatic, riveting fashion through his horrific treatment of Roxy, Rose, Jake, and Kanaya. Meat is the origin of a devil, an incredible horror story with Dirk as its eldritch monster, and I had a blast rereading it. My biggest complaint about Meat is the fight against Lord English, which is pointlessly gory and mean-spirited, although admittedly, it becomes a lot more palatable when it clicks that Dirk is likely responsible for the brutal deaths of John Egbert and a bunch of disposable teenagers, and those scenes help contrast the plot of Candy. Right, Candy, the bad epilogue. I don't think I'll get much pushback for saying Meat is good, but here's the plot twist. I also think the Candy is well written. That's right, I like both epilogues and think that they are good. But how can I say that, given all the fucked up and comfortable stuff that happened in Candy that I listed earlier? Well, that's a really shitty way to approach media criticism. What I did earlier, just listing off plot points without paying any attention to the themes of the story or what the author is trying to say, that is intellectually dishonest. And ultimately, that is how people approach the epilogues, by listing off out-of-context plot points they don't like without ever even attempting to assess the work as a whole or what it is about thematically, by hating them without even reading them because a college friend said that they were bad. I'm going to go through Candy one more time, this time going over some scenes that I skipped and explaining what it all means. And cue the suburban jungle! Let's start at the beginning. John Egbert decides to stay on Earthsea. He doesn't want to take the fate of everyone's existence into his hands and just wants to enjoy life. Roxy is overjoyed, and so is Calliope, because they're no longer in the limbo of waiting for John to go back and fight Lord English. She says that she has big plans for John, which is an ominous thing to say that goes nowhere. Calliope asks him to set Gamzee free so he can have his redemption arc. As an aside, in Meat, when John zaps into the game over timeline, he shoves Gamzee into the refrigerator to put an end to his preposterous narrative relevance because he will lend nothing valuable whatsoever if allowed to remain outside. That is very clearly not a thing that John is thinking, that is Dirk's narration. It's interesting that the epilogues give us these two warring narrators, Dirk and Calliope, and they have different ideas on what to do with Gamzee. I mean, it's a different Calliope, but Calliope is Calliope. I could absolutely see Al wanting John to set Gamzee free. But Dirk is right. Gamzee sucks. John, having met Gamzee, is weirded out by Calliope's request, but he does it anyway. When Gamzee starts talking about redemption, John thinks it's stupid because, to quote, Gamzee is the worst person he has ever met in his life. I feel like John is exaggerating because he barely knows Gamzee. Then again, John's only interaction with Gamzee in the original comic, as far as I can remember, is Gamzee fucking with his head and giving him nightmares for years, as part of a scheme to make Jack Noir go terminal, after which he murders John's father, so yeah, John's right, Gamzee is the worst. John can't talk about this with Roxy or Calliope, so he contacts Terezi, who is still out looking for Vriska. She asks him to kick Gamzee in the codpiece. John tells her that everyone misses her. John goes on a date with Roxy at a coffee shop, and hey, that sure is a popular AO3 tag. Roxy tries to rekindle their relationship. Calliope is a bit jealous, so Gamzee offers to murder John. She says no, because John has made his choice, and now they all have to live with the repercussions. It's okay though, because everyone is going to be very, very happy. Roxy goes to the bathroom, and Gamzee gives John romantic advice. Jesus Christ, he is the worst. John sends Terezi a photo of Gamzee, and the message, I fucking hate this. John talks to Terezi about his relationship with Roxy. He has feelings for her, at least according to the narration, and oh god, Dirk has ruined my ability to trust any information that the epilogues ever say. No, I think that his feelings are genuine. They appeared in the original comic, and he talks about them in his conversations with Terezi. Still, he has trepidation because he is a depressed dork who has never actually been in a real relationship before, and because Roxy is in a vaguely romantic relationship with Calliope. Roxy is very forward about her feelings with John, but he can't tell what she's thinking. When he looks into her eyes, it's like staring into a void. Roxy asks John if he ever thinks about gender, and he doesn't understand what she's talking about, because John is both somehow able to turn into wind, and also denser than a fucking black hole. Roxy talks about how makeup and dresses are just costumes, and how she feels like she's just play acting at being a grown-up woman. John misses the point again, but does come to the conclusion that adulthood is weird, and you never actually feel like an adult. And he's right. For example, I started reading Homestuck when I was 13, and 11 years later, I still feel just as young. Maybe because I'm still reading fucking Homestuck. Dave runs into John and asks him about his own messy love triangle. John suggests flipping a coin, and Dave tells him that he does not grasp the metaphysical implications, as he painfully learned back in Act 5-2, that makes split timelines. Choosing what to have for lunch also creates split timelines, I guess. John thinks back to his conversation with Rose about how things were going to become non-canon, and thus basically meaningless. John shrugs and says that Dave's problems don't sound canon to him, and hey, that's a really fucked up thing to say. Even if Dave's problems aren't canon, and to be clear, they are not canon, they're real to Dave. Dave walks away, and John thinks that he could have done more. That he might have just fucked up Dave's entire life. Oops. Dave goes to meet with Dirk. Gamzee is waiting for him. Gamzee, as it turns out, was the last person to talk to Dirk. What Dirk says to Gamzee isn't clear, but Gamzee says that he's going to give Dave what's best for him, because it's what Dirk's last wish was. He says that a sack of meat and bones in one life or the next is only a means to the final totality that will damn and raise us all in brilliant apotheosis. In the one true life, we all flow from the one true pen, and every head rolls down the path to the one true hand. Dirk kills himself because a cosmic coin flip has rendered his life inessential. He is stuck in a dead-end existence without stakes, challenges, structures, or themes. He can feel the corrosion beginning, the gears slowing, all the intricate, unseen mechanisms coming unhinged from their mooring and drifting apart. His choice is not between that of life and death, it is between an ignominious dissolution at the hands of entropy and one final act of relevance that can bequeath his meager energies to the cosmic well from whence they came. He's never felt so free. He thinks that his death is the very last moment of narratively consequential action that will happen in this world. Or, to put it in simpler terms, Dirk kills himself because he realized he was stuck in a shitty fanfic and hated it. This is what Gamzee talks about at Dirk's funeral. Dirk was prepared to be the evil mastermind we saw in Meat, the villain pulling all the strings, but that was taken away from him. John Egbert decided this world would be the laid-back coffee shop Candyland, but that isn't a world where Dirk could exist. As explained back in October, Dirk is a control freak who only knows how to function in a stressful situation. He can't stand being in the happy dating sim world, and he especially can't stand the fact that he isn't in control anymore. At the funeral, John realizes he can't use his retcon powers anymore. Roxy asks him to marry her, and John is rightfully shocked. Everything is happening way too fast. It doesn't feel right. The narration, who I am still suspicious of, says that that's how love is supposed to feel. John says okay. They get married. John continues messaging Terezi to tell her about his wedding and Roxy's pregnancy. They talk about the polyamorous relationships between Jake, Jane, and Gamzee, and Dave, Jade, and Carcat. Apparently Dave took a picture of Gamzee and Jane fucking and sent it to Terezi. Ew. They gossip, and Terezi points out the resentment is building in the Jade, Dave, Carcat trio. Terezi talks about kismessitudes and how they push you to better yourself. John realizes that's why Terezi is searching for Vriska. Terezi says it's complicated, and she would prefer a low-key relationship with someone she could torment. John and Roxy hang out with Rose and Kanaya. John points out how fucking weird it is to Goku Naruto Vriska Jr., and that sentence is absolute gibberish if you have not read the epilogues. Roxy says that they're going to name their son Harry Anderson after John's brother, you know, the guy from Night Court. John is bugged by the fact that Roxy didn't come up with any suggestions on her own. Rose points out that John came up with the name because the show Night Court reminds him of his father and says that they need to name the next generation after the fallen heroes they admire. John asks if they really admire Vriska. Rose says that, despite her faults, Vriska defeated Lord English. John has a panic attack because no she fucking didn't. Rose says, yes she did. Why else would we be here? John brings up Rose's big speech about Canon, and Rose says, that's all in the past, John. Everything worked out in the end. Why are you getting so upset about this? When John closes his eyes, he still sees the black hole. Still sees space cracking around him. Why isn't it important anymore? Why? He wonders if any of this is real. He messages the only person he could talk to, Terezi. He says, things aren't good. Everyone is acting crazy, and he feels like he's the only sane person in the entire universe. He's the only one who cares about anything. He loves Roxy, but she just goes along with whatever he says. Just smells like a fucking Stepford wife. There's nothing but a void behind her eyes, he thinks. He wants for her to want something different from him, to act like a person with her own thoughts, but she doesn't. Roxy and everyone else are acting like poorly written knockoffs of themselves. Let's circle back to some ideas I talked about earlier. How, in a lot of fan fictions, villainous characters are treated as poor soft woobies by fans who like them, even if they are terrible, terrible people. Draco in leather pants is the term TV Tropes uses. Gamzee Makara suddenly being treated as a good person because he, without any prompting, without doing literally anything to make up for his horrible treatment of other people, said he was a good person now, is such a blatant, cartoonishly stupid piece of writing. It is the thing you would see in a parody of bad fanfiction. And you know who else thinks that? John Egbert! He calls it the dumbest fucking idea he's ever heard. And the inverse, Jane Crocker suddenly becoming a fascist rapist dictator and Gamzee constantly sucking on her titties? Tell me, does that sound like something that would happen in Homestuck or something that would happen in a bad fanfiction? She's Ron Weasley putting on his wizard clan robes for the sake of the plot, and again, John is the one person to realize something is wrong. The weirdly sexual stuff, the dumb fucking names for the children, the constant focus on relationships, the fucking visit to a coffee shop. These are all things you would see in a weird fanfic by an author who forces their ships to get together and keeps inserting their weird kinks. And of course, John knows it is weird. He knows that Dave's relationship drama is weird, that Rose becoming apathetic is weird, that Roxy only ever thinking about how much she loves him is fucking weird. He knows that something is wrong. Homestuck was a very, very metatextual story that was about, at its deepest core, what it means to be a fictional character. What happens when the entire story is building to a big final battle that doesn't happen. What it means to be forced into the destiny of being a hero against your will. What it feels like to have massive chunks of the story just retconned out of existence. To have vital pieces of your own character development taken away, leaving you feeling empty. The Homestuck epilogues are about a very similar thing. They begin with a goddamn archive of our own screen, a giant billboard explaining very blatantly that the epilogues are a deconstruction of the idea of fanfiction. Rose tells John that if he doesn't fight Lord English, reality is going to begin dissipating. That his friends are going to become less and less stable, less true, because reality is crumbling. Because Earthsea is becoming a bad fanfic. She also tells John that because of his retcon powers, he is immune to the dissipation. Everyone else, they're gonna change. They're gonna stop being their true selves because nothing in Candy is true, but John will be fine. He gets to sit back and watch the consequences of his inaction. Both epilogues are centered on a very simple concept. Meat is about Dirk Strider becoming the narrator, and Candy is about John Egbert becoming trapped in a bad fanfic. Throughout Candy, weird, fucked up shit happens, and John is usually the only one to notice that something is wrong. It's like if in My Immortal, Dumbledore burst in and shouted, "What the hell are you doing, you motherfuckers?" Then Harry said, "What? Why is Dumbledore acting so weird? Also, why are we all goths, spelled with an F?" And that is such an interesting, complex idea for a story. The arc John goes through is something completely unique, but it still feels like a story only Homestuck could tell. And to strip this story of what it is about, to merely say bad things happen because it is bad, is intellectually dishonest. It is bad media criticism. There's no such thing as a good or a bad plot point. It's about how those plot points are used to tell the story the author wants to tell. And what's frustrating is, Homestuck fans used to understand this. People don't look back on Homestuck and say it's bad because John suddenly got killed off and then the art got bad and it became really sexist. And it became a harem comic where Dave made a sword out of porn and then made out with his sister, and then it stopped being a comic and just became really bad pinups of underage girls. And if you're saying, what? Go reread Homestuck. All of that happened. In Homestuck, Calborn took over the comic and transformed it into a terrible misogynistic parody. And back in 2013, Homestuck fans understood it was a parody as part of the comic's metatextual analysis of the concept of storytelling. But when Hussey very blatantly did the same thing 6 years later, most Homestuck fans didn't get the joke. They thought that everything was meant to be taken completely literally, even though every single goddamn page in Homestuck had layers of meaning. And I'd say it's because the Candy timeline is a more convincing fake than the Land of Someone's Handicrafts I took, except, archive of our own page. The Homestuck epilogues, Candy especially, are deconstructions of fanfiction, and a lot of people who read them were not interested in deconstructions of fanfiction. And that's fine. The Homestuck epilogues, even more so than Homestuck, are a very niche story. But I wish the discourse around them treated them as what they are. People don't say, I dislike the story because it is a metatextual deconstruction of the concept of fanfiction, and I am not a fan of that stylistically. They say, this is bad because it featured insert scene here described out of context. I wish people would engage with the epilogues on the level that they were very clearly designed to be engaged with. Like, you know how some people hate musicals and it's annoying? I mean, it isn't wrong to not enjoy musicals, but if you go to a musical after being told it's a musical and your criticism is, I didn't like the singing because I don't like musicals, then that isn't good criticism. And neither is, I didn't like the meditation on fanfiction because it felt like fanfiction. Calborn's chapters did not feature real versions of the Homestuck cast. They were non-sentient props that existed as puppets for the story's narrator to command. John called them bogus versions. What John comes to realize is, because of the dissipation of canon, everyone else is, for all intents and purposes, a bogus version. He realizes that, he married bogus Roxy. She isn't the girl he had feelings for back in the actual comic because she, like everything else, is part of the fake fanfic world. Homestuck was about kids who traveled into a video game world, and unfortunately, John is now trapped in a world of NPCs. Roxy isn't a person anymore. She's the love interest in a dating sim who pops out pre-written lines when you press the spacebar and marries you because that's what's supposed to happen. Roxy throws away her feelings for Calliope, her thoughts about gender, any emotions other than an empty-headed nod the moment she gets together with John. He knows this, and he hates it. John isn't the only one unaffected by the fanficification. Terezi isn't on Earthsea, and thus isn't affected. John talks to Terezi again and again, and develops feelings for her, because she's the only thing he knows is real anymore. Dirk was also still sentient, and I'm pretty sure Gamzee is too. I think he realized very quickly that he was dragged into a bad fanfic, and decided to just play along with it for his own amusement. John gets in touch with Terezi again 3 years later. He says that he's grown numb to everything that has happened. Terezi says that he's going through pathetic midlife ennui. It's worth noting that John and Terezi's conversations take place over different time periods. A few minutes for her is weeks or even years for him. John says he's worried about her and wonders if she's dead every time she leaves him hanging. John says he can't believe Jane became all genocidal because he knew a version of her who was a sweet old lady. And I feel like this is a good time to ask, why Jane? Because Jane is very obviously the most out of character of anyone in the epilogues. Dirk being evil I can understand, but Jane? Why? And I guess the answer is, because someone had to be the asshole. The writers of Candy wanted to have a character become evil as part of the deconstruction of fanfiction, and she was the only one who could fit that role. It couldn't be John because he's the one who observes everything falling apart. It couldn't be Dirk because he isn't in Candy. It couldn't be Roxy because her loving and boring relationship with John is the bedrock of the story. It couldn't be Terezi because she's back in Paradox Space. It couldn't be a new character because that wouldn't have any emotional weight. And I mean, who else would have been less controversial? Dave, Rose, Carcat? And I mean, it sucks that Jane got done so dirty, but if someone had to be transformed into a poorly written villain, Jane has some unique advantages. In Homestuck, she is probably the least developed main character. She has the least dialogue out of the 8 humans, and spends nearly all of the last quarter of the comic either brainwashed or unconscious. Her arc doesn't really have a satisfying conclusion. Even Jake and Karkat got bigger moments to shine at the end than Jane. She's also, from what I've seen online, the least popular main character. Personally, I don't dislike Jane, but I'd be lying if I said that she made the top 10 of characters that I like. And to be fair, there is a precedent for Jane being evil. Crocker tier Jane. Jane acted like an evil authoritarian rapist dedicated to creating an ethno-state in Homestuck when she was mind-controlled by the Condents. It's interesting that, in illustrations of Jane in Homestuck 2 and beyond canon, Jane wears red. In terms of personality, Epilogues Jane acts like a mix between her 2 personas. And that's dumb, because Jane was only evil because of mind control, but I don't know. Maybe Arqueus fucked up removing the tiara top and her brain is still messed up? Like, if I had to give an explanation that makes sense, that's the only one that springs to mind. But of course, the point is that it doesn't make sense. Jane is an asshole because it's a bad fanfic. That's a big part of the story Candy is trying to tell. Except here's the problem with Candy. Candy is supposed to be the sugary sweet cartoon world where everything is wonderful and pointless. It's supposed to be a fluff fic. So why the fuck is there rape and genocide? The central premise of the story is violated, and honestly, I think it would be better if it hadn't. It would be boring if it was just marriages and babies and John being depressed, but it at least wouldn't be actively painful to read half of the time. Why the hell is this bowl of candy filled with blood? Part of it is because it needed to set up the sequel. And that makes sense, but the sequel has its own fair share of problems, and stories should be able to stand on their own. It's also possible that the Candy timeline is being corrupted. It was originally going to be happy and fluffy, but something poisoned it. If there is a source of this corruption, maybe it's Dirk's suicide. Things spiral out of control after he dies, and he did ominously think that his death was a gift to the people of Earthsea. Dirk hates fluffy, meandering bullshit. I could see him leaving chaos and destruction behind, and genuinely thinking him doing so was a moral choice. Except Jane's rape of Jake happened before that. Maybe the darkness is being caused by someone else. The narrator, perhaps. By the way, who the fuck is narrating Candy? It is very clear what character is the narrator in Meat, and in every scene of the original Homestuck, but the narrator of Candy is not made clear. I like the theory that Al is the narrator. She is able to take over as narrator in Meat and briefly does so again in Candy, except Al has a very distinctive writing style that the narrator of Candy doesn't match. It's possible that the narrator is hussy, except that detracts from the whole bad fanfic thing. I genuinely don't know who is narrating the story, but they could be the one making everything so horrible. Part of the reason I like Al being the narrator, even if it doesn't fit perfectly, is because she doesn't really get humanity. She's an alien who spent an eternity isolated. She could genuinely think that Jane's dubious consent and relationship with Gamzee were fluffy candy stuff. Dirk says in Meat that what cherubs idealize is sugar so potent that it is poison to the soul, and hey, that sounds a bit like Candy. To be honest, I wouldn't stake my life on guessing who the narrator of Candy is, and that makes Candy harder to understand. Part of the reason Meat works better is because it is more explicit about what is going on and why. Where was I? Right, John talking to Terezi. John asks if it is immoral to kidnap a child if they're being abused and you can give them a better life. Terezi assumes this is dirty talk because Terezi is Terezi. John asks for a photo so he can see her again. It's clear that he's beginning to care about her more than Roxy or Harry Anderson. But, to be fair, he doesn't think his wife is real. If she was a real person with more than a void behind her eyes, she would care that Jane is genocidal. John loves his wife and son, but he's scared that it's all an illusion, that he'll open his eyes and his fears will come true, that all of it will be a lie, that the dream will crumble and he'll wake up in another world. John decides to do something drastic, both because it's the right thing to do and because if Roxy doesn't react, then he'll know she isn't real. Harry Anderson's birthday party is held at Jane's mansion. Jane gives him an armed security drone to follow him around. Roxy says it would be rude to refuse a gift. John is planning to kidnap Tavros Crocker, his brother? God, it is weird that Tavros is a full brother to John and Jade, as opposed to being a half-sibling like Harry, Joey, Jude, and Anne. Jesus Christ, Jake Harley liked to fuck. Also, Harry, the younger Harry that is is a half-brother to Rose and Dave? God, this family tree is so messy. Jade says that once she and Dave get married, that John will be both Dave's father-in-law and his brother-in-law, and no he won't. Jake will be Dave's father-in-law. John is already Dave's stepfather. This family tree is so tangled that the main characters don't actually understand it. Anyway, brother napping. John takes Tavros to the side. It's clear that Jane is abusive to Tav, at least emotionally. John asks if Gamzee is molesting Tavros, and he says that Gamzee is training him in combat, philosophy, life, and love, which is the phrase used for Dirk's relationships with Dave and Jake. So maybe not child molestation, but definitely fucked up. John is so furious that he shakes the room with his wind powers. As John is breaking open the window, Jade walks in. Jade warns him that Jane will execute him and says this will make everything worse. John yells at her, saying things can't get any worse. Tavros asks if it is kidnapping, if he badly would like to go. Jade says that Jane is one of the most powerful people on the planet and will take her son back. She is against stealing somebody's child. Foreshadowing. John yells that he is the only one who ever seems to realize that something's wrong. He says that Jade ruined Karkat and Dave's relationship, and that Dave is only with her out of obligation. Blow blow, but he isn't wrong. He says she's just like Jane, that she's selfish, and that he doesn't even know who she is anymore. John's wind picks up, tearing apart the bedroom. Everyone else enters. John calls Jane a genocidal control freak. Jane says that Dirk was the control freak, and she was relieved when he died. Yikes. The wind picks up, surrounding John with a cyclone that smashes apart the room. Dave says he's sick of the relationship shit and asks John to stop with the wind. He can't because he isn't the problem. John rants about Jane and Gamzee and the cuckolding. He shouts that it's all bullshit. His wind tears apart the windows, showering everyone in broken glass. Roxy and Dave refuse to look at John. Harry Anderson starts crying. Tavros hides from him, terrified. It's worth noting that John ignores Tavros and Jake even as he's ostensibly fighting for them. He's mad at their treatment, but he's mostly mad at the world, at everything around him being broken, and everyone he cares about being different. John flies away. He looks down on Earth's sea, and it feels like a model inside a bubble. It's an illusion, and the illusion is cracking. In the Candy epilogue, John thinks that the sky looks fake, that it's too blue. In Meet, when he returns back to his childhood home in Washington, John realizes that the sky finally looks real, because it isn't so colorful. John talks to Terezi again. She's dying. She's been traveling for so long, through a void without time, and she's run out of supplies. Small discretion, but want to know how long Terezi has been looking for Vriska? Well, she left sometime between the ending of Homestuck, which happened when she was 16, and John's 18th birthday, when she would have been 18. In Homestuck 2, which takes place 3 years after the epilogues from her perspective, Terezi is 28, meaning she spent at least 7 years searching for Vriska. Damn, she deserves better. Terezi starts to think that maybe nothing is real, and says she can't remember the sound of anyone's voice but her own. John, of course, also thinks that everything is fake. They flirt. John asks when Terezi is going to give up and accept that Vriska is dead and that none of them are ever going to see her again. He says that Vriska doesn't deserve her friendship, and yeah, she doesn't! Vriska would not spend 7 years searching for Terezi. Right before Collide, she fucked off to go steal the spotlight one last time without giving Terezi any closure. Terezi explains that something within her is missing, that there is a void in her heart and she'll never be able to be happy. John feels the same way. He wonders if he's actually dead, like Bruce Willis in that movie where he's dead. You know, Die Hard. That's why it's called Die Hard, because it was hard for him to die. John says that she's the only person who understands him because they both have these big howling holes inside of them and make each other feel less lonely. They fill each other's holes, but Terezi says she's going to lay down and that it would almost be a relief if she didn't wake up. John begs her to come home, but Earthsea isn't her home. She doesn't have a home. Terezi explains that she retconned away a big chunk of her soul. She erased all of her regret and grief, but what did that leave her with? Terezi is such a good fucking character. Get that Dave video 20,000 views so I can ramble about her. John says that the only thing she can do is let go of Vriska, but Terezi can't. She says goodbye. John asks why she messaged him. Because she wanted to give him the courtesy of closure. Goddamn, this is why I can't hate the epilogues. Even if they are flawed, even if they stumble in their execution, I can't hate them when they make me feel the things I feel. And then, John's father's car crashes out of the sky. It's filled with shaving cream, tobacco, and 2 colors of bloodstains. Red and teal, already dried. He realizes that Terezi is dead, that she's been dead for a long time. His one remaining friend, the one person who was real, is gone. Why the hell should he care about anything anymore? He's the only real thing left in a world that is fake. His fingers flex into claws, gathering up dirt into his shaking fists. He bears down until his knuckles turn white and his fingernails press sharply into the flesh of his palms. The pain makes him feel real. All he's ever wanted is to be fucking real. Then, as if not quite finished with the sky just yet, he turns his gaze upward to give it one last angry look. He feels consumed in that moment by the acuteness of his physicality and the overwhelming scale of his cosmic irrelevance. His lungs fill with air, and he releases all of his years of pent-up frustration and anger and guilt and doubt and weakness and pain and misery in a blood-curdling shout that sounds more like it's from the mouth of an animal than a man. John screams at the merciless sky until his throat is raw, and he has no energy left even to cry. No one hears him, and if they had, it wouldn't matter. John closes himself off from the world. He separates from Roxy and stops talking to his son. He goes back to doing what he was doing at the end of Homestuck, sitting in his house, alone. 10 years later, John attends Dave and Jade's wedding. John spots Karkat spying on the wedding and goes to talk to him. Karkat asks John to join the rebellion, but John is too depressed and apathetic. John talks to Dave. Dave almost brings up a plot point fans hate, but John cuts him off. Dave's reaction to being married is a shrug and a whatever. He says he hoped Karkat would show up. He still isn't over him. John keeps waiting for the day when this feeling of emptiness goes away. He's still waiting for that final battle, the chance he threw away. 10 years after her death, John tears apart the photo of Terezi. Whatever happens now, it doesn't matter. And now that John's come to that conclusion, it's time for things to start mattering again. Vriska crashes down in front of John and she is pissed. She shouts that she needs to go back. She needs to see how it all ends. Unfortunately for Vriska, the black hole is a one-way trip. Welcome to Earth C, Vriska! It fucking sucks! This is the worst possible thing that could have happened to Vriska, and I love it. John brings up the fact that Rose and Vriska's daughter is also named Vriska. Vriska Prime calls it the stupidest fucking thing she's ever heard. John agrees. John suggests that, because they're 2 Vriskas, they call the original Vriska, Vriska in parentheses. And for this version of Vriska, who demeaned the version of Vriska who actually went through character development and made her the Vriska in parentheses, to be made the new parenthetical Vriska, is just excellent. John explains everything that Jane and Karkat have been up to. Parentheses says the story fucking sucks, and that Mina showing up is even dumber than naming a child after her. Parentheses asks how they fucked it all up so much. John says, my bad. He explains that everything is a festering fustercluck because of him. They're twisted and unhappy because of him, because he chose his happiness over the fate of the universe. Everything is unraveling, and he's the only one who's even real anymore. That's another facet of John's downward spiral. He believes that it's all his fault, that everything is broken because of this one little choice he made. Homestuck was about video games, and this is how video game protagonists work. Whether the good ending or the terrible ending happen is up to the player. No one in a video game has free will except for the main character, except for John Egbert. John laughs this off because he's moved past sorrow and anger and onto complete apathy. John points out that the god-tier rules reward them for being useless pieces of shit and lazing around. It's a pretty good joke, he thinks. Parentheses tells John that he's sucking himself off. Reality doesn't care about John, it cares about her. Parentheses complains that she's trapped in the dumb fake world. John says it'll all work out. Or it won't. It doesn't really matter either way. John asks if Parentheses ever saw Terezi. Parentheses says no. And goddamn, the tragedy about those two is that Terezi loves Parentheses enough to spend 7 years starving for a chance to see her again, while Parentheses would abandon Terezi in a heartbeat. She asks if John is in love with Terezi. John says it doesn't really matter, because like everything, it was just non-canon bullshit. Parentheses shouts that she doesn't care about canon or the war or John's love life. She needs someone to get her out of this fucking nightmare before she loses her shit. Gamzee pops up. God damn it. He tells Parentheses that she needs to go through a redemption arc because of her tragic backstory. Gamzee puts his hand on her shoulder. Parentheses snaps and starts beating the shit out of Gamzee. John watches Parentheses attempt to beat Gamzee to death. She realizes he's into it and becomes so incredibly furious that She starts making out with him. No! No, stop! Don't! Oh, also parentheses is 16. So yep, Gamzee is a kid diddler in the story. Ew, 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 ew. Mercifully, John is called away by Rose. Rose brings up the fact that none of this is canon or true anymore. She looks John in the eye and says thank you. John is confused. Didn't he fuck everything up and make Earthsea into a meaningless hell world where war is beginning? Rose shrugs. The war is irrelevant, but at least it's something to do. She's thankful because John gave her a chance to be happy. In the complacency of the learned, heaven disappears if you realize what it is. Those with knowledge can never be happy. But Rose doesn't have any knowledge anymore. Her visions are gone. She doesn't care if the world isn't true or canon. She has a wife she loves, a daughter she is proud of. It can all be senseless, ephemeral noise that dissolves in the void. A whisper swept up by the wind before it's uttered. She's still grateful to have felt this way. For Rose, at least, John made the right choice. The candy world does not matter. The war is stupid bullshit that the reader doesn't care about. But in this world untethered by canon, Rose is able to be happy. And what's interesting is, she isn't an NPC. Rose is still sentient. She's just embraced the fake world rather than hiding from it like John did. Interesting. Vriska, the one who is Rose's daughter and is dating John's son, not the one who got parentheticaled, decides to capture Gamzee so she can get promoted in the war. John tries to stop her, but he's too late. She walks in on the other Vriska fucking a clown. Both Vriska scream. John decides to walk away, leaving his friend's daughter with the scary child molester clown. Hey, what the fuck, John? Parentheses realizes she has hit rock bottom. Scratch that she is jackhammering through the stubborn concrete of rock bottom. Gamzee takes a picture to send to Carcat. Parentheses tells him that he isn't allowed to ever tell anyone about what happened. Gamzee claims that she took advantage of him and calls her problematic. Parentheses strangles him to death with her bare hands. Good fucking riddance. Now you might say, wasn't Gamzee immortal? Yes. Gamzee was immortal in Homestuck because he needed to be alive to ensure Lord English's creation. He was kept alive by Canon. Except, Canon isn't here right now. Gamzee's purpose cannot be fulfilled, which means he can die. Gonna be real, the story did not have to have a sex scene involving Gamzee and a teenager. I think it is worse because of that. That was a bridge too far. Especially because this is the later part of the epilogues where the weird stuff starts being toned down and it starts giving all of these really touching character moments. Like the whiplash of going from clown fucking to that amazing scene with John and Rose, then back to clown fucking. It's absurd. John goes home to have a slow motion existential crisis. He can't find comfort in everything's insignificance like Rose did. What is the point of everything if everything is meaningless? He's awoken by Jake and Tav. Jake is wearing only his underwear because Jane owned all of his clothes and he didn't want to take anything she would miss. He took her son and himself, but I mean, Jane probably won't miss them. She's an asshole. Jake asks to stay with John. John points out that he tried to help them years ago. He feels no sympathy for Jake. He's a pathetic loser, no more worthy of John's energy than a sim stuck in a pool. Except, what about Tavros? He only exists because of John's actions. It's kind of fucked up that John's actions made a child exist just to suffer. Bitches apologizes for being a bitch. He and Jake start drinking together. Jake asks if John thinks he is a bad person. He asks if he's ruined the most important relationship, the unbreakable bond between a man and his son. John says it isn't Jake's fault, it's his. This doesn't make things better for Jake. He says maybe it's time for someone to blame Jake for once. He says that he's gone through his life with the mindset that nothing has ever really been within his control. He's always just done what Dirk and Jane told him to do because it was comforting to let someone else make the tough choices for him. But he should have stopped when his son was born. He should have done better. John realizes that he's been doing exactly what Jake does, treating the reason his life is the way it is as the result of the metaphysical shape of reality as a way to brush off his failures as a father. Jake realizes he's just making excuses. John says there's a difference between making excuses and explaining reasons. It's only an excuse if he doesn't make an effort to start trying to fix himself. Jake got his son out of an abusive situation. That's a start. Jake realizes John is right. He stood up for himself, for once. The nice thing about Jake is that he's so stupid that convincing him to turn his life around takes like 10 seconds. Jake asks John if he can stay, and John says sure. Jake's hope has broken through John's apathy. You know, I did not expect a conversation between John and Jake to be one of the key emotional moments of the epilogues. Jake says John should try and make amends with Roxy. John says there isn't a point because she isn't real. Jake says to stop blaming Roxy for his problems and says he's acting crazy. She's as real as Jake is, even if it's hard to tell what she's thinking. Wow! Someone treating Roxy with respect. That's a rare sight in the epilogues. John says that he's fucked up and it's too late to change anything. Jake tells him to at least try so he can say he gave it his all. And what about Harry Anderson? Does he really want to go the rest of his life knowing he never even tried to be the father his son needed? John thinks that if Roxy isn't real, then his son must be even faker. Except, there is a hope radiating off Jake that makes John want to believe in something he knows is fake. He asks for Roxy's number. They meet again and John tells her that he completely fucked up her life. Not just their marriage, but everything. He points out that Roxy was heading in a different direction, the path they took and meet, and John took that away from them. Roxy's life took a backseat to John's happiness. Roxy tells him that what he's saying is hot steaming horseshit. John thinks that his choices are the only ones that matters, that he's the only person in the entire timeline who is sentient, but plot twist, Roxy likes her life. It isn't perfect, she's made mistakes, but John has no right to tell her it's fucked up or that it isn't real because it's her fucking life. So, in case it wasn't obvious, Roxy is every bit as sentient as John. She isn't an NPC or a bogus clone. She's a real person with thoughts and emotions. But you already knew that, right? Dun dun dun! The video essay about the book with unreliable narrators itself had an unreliable narrator. I lied! I treated John's delusions as factual to make the themes of the video come across better. John Egbert is an unreliable narrator is the wrong word because John isn't the narrator, but John's view of the world isn't right. John thinks that he's the only real person left, the only one whose choices matter, and he is so fucking wrong. Every single one of his friends is real. They aren't acting out of character because they're fake clones, they're acting differently because people change. The idea that they don't is just something that John thinks, and John Egbert is full of shit. John is so fucking arrogant and candy. He acts like he's in the Truman Show, and that drives him to stop caring about anything, but it's all real. I mean, it's fictional, but it's as real as he is. Candy isn't the timeline that led to the creation of Lord English, but since when are alternate timelines any less meaningful to the plot of Homestuck? John and Roxy are from an alternate timeline. There's this idea that shows up in both epilogues that Roxy is hard to understand because of their void powers, but no they aren't. Their thoughts can't be read off by Dirk, but that doesn't mean there's some unknowable anomaly, or worse, basically brain dead. Roxy acts in a consistent and understandable manner. For example, at the start of Candy, she comes on to John because, gasp, she likes John Egbert. I mean, I think she's playing it up because their relationship has been in limbo for years, but again, that is a perfectly understandable behavior. And when she asks John to marry her, he assumes it's because she's an empty-headed NPC, but maybe she does so because her best friend just killed himself and she isn't taking it well. Maybe when she says, "We're gonna be so freaking happy," she's pretending to smile because she's dealing with trauma. She doesn't fight with Jane, "Oh, that's because she's an NPC." No! She grew up in a post-apocalyptic hellscape with a single hand's worth of friends. Her friendship with Jane is important to her. It might not be the right choice, but she prioritizes her bond with Jane over the lives of strangers. It's notable that the scene where John talks to Roxy is almost entirely told from her perspective, something that the epilogues normally avoid, which hammers in that, yeah, Roxy has a brain and a personality. It's made clear that Roxy is irritated about John abandoning her and Harry Anderson, and by his constant, self-flagellating apologies. John hurt her, and all of this could have been avoided if John treated his wife like a human being and had a single goddamn conversation with her. Maybe I'm being too hard on John. He deals with some very real depression throughout Candy, and his downward spiral was prompted by his friends acting like assholes. But again, all of this could have been avoided if he just talked about his feelings for once, if he let other people in instead of pushing them away. John is surprised to see Roxy snap at him because he thought she was incapable of feeling emotions. Roxy yells that she wasn't just acting how he wanted her to act, she was submissive because she struggles to stand up for herself and is learning to get better at it. John says she wasn't like that before. Where the fuck does he get off on trying to describe what is or isn't like being her enough? People don't stay the same for their whole damn lives. John asks if she's ever felt like their lives weren't the way things should be. What does that even mean? She likes the way things turned out just fine. She tells John he should stop wasting his eternity thinking he's special and that it's his fault everyone isn't perfectly happy. John finally starts to understand her. He says it's hard to not feel like an asshole. There's a canon timeline out there and they aren't in it anymore. Roxy says, so what? What does that have to do with her life? What makes this world lesser? John says Roxy was heading in a different direction back at the start of Candy. Roxy says, yeah, she was. But it isn't like she forgot about her thoughts on gender. So let's talk about Roxy's gender identity. Part of the reason I think Meat works better first is because Roxy goes by he, him pronouns at the end of Meat, but notably does not in Candy. And this helps set up in the reader's mind that this is because of John. That John changed Roxy into this unthinking Stepford wife. Except, Candy Roxy has the same thoughts about gender as Meat Roxy. She just never felt like she could talk about it with anyone. She tells him this, and he asks if she has regrets. How does she not second-guess every choice she ever makes? Roxy says that she doesn't think she can regret anything. There isn't only one right way to be Roxy Lalonde, and she likes who she is. She doesn't strongly identify as a woman. She still doesn't really care about any of that. I think the best way to describe Roxy is that in both timelines, they are non-binary. They just chose different presentations and pronouns as they are exploring who they are, and that's fine. John didn't make Roxy stop being trans, and that's kind of the whole point. I'm not sure how I feel about Roxy's gender identity being treated as a plot device in the arcs of two men who don't respect them, but how Roxy acts is consistent. They're the same person, they just chose different paths to walk down. Also, it's stated that being pregnant was gender-affirming for Roxy, something she can't explain to John, and that isn't really something I can relate to, so I'll just say, sure. John and Roxy walk away from their conversation on good terms, finally having said what they've been bottling up for years. They aren't together again, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Maybe eventually, but John has to earn that, in my opinion. Harry Anderson comes home and John asks his son if he wants to go for a drive. This is the end of John's arc in Candy, and what an arc it is. His slow descent into hopelessness, his despair over losing Terezi, his apathy brought on by the nagging idea that everything around him is fake, and then 3 conversations that shake his worldview, make him start seeing his loved ones as people again. John ends Candy by, for the first time, acting like a real father. He abandoned his son because he didn't think he was real, and maybe he isn't, but that doesn't really matter. Truth or fanfic, canon or non-canon, it does not matter. This is the world John lives in, and it's time for him to start caring about it. Candy is the story of John Egbert, and that story is good. The surrounding parts, As I've said, I understand that you need the bad parts to help get across John's despair and feelings of loneliness. It doesn't make sense for John to get furious about everything being bullshit if it isn't, well, bullshit. But I think the Candy goes just a bit too far, and some of it was unnecessary. But still, at the end of the day, I like Candy. When it's good, it's brilliant. And quite honestly, I respect the hell out of this epilogue. To toss aside what the audience wanted, to tell a beautiful, if messy story that no one else could tell, that is what Homestuck was. Flawed, complicated, unorthodox, and ultimately beautiful. There are a few scenes I haven't talked about yet, and a few characters whose arcs I've left incomplete. For example, the 2 Vriskas look at clouds while using Gamzee's corpse as a pillow. Parentheses mentions that John is really, really powerful. Not because of his lame wind powers, and hey, John's wind powers are incredibly strong and cool. No, Vriska thinks that John is powerful because he has the ability to bend reality to his will. He's the main character and will always be more relevant than Parentheses, no matter how hard she tries to steal the spotlight. Vriska says that John is a loser, and Parentheses says she's right! John is a loser, and that doesn't make you cooler, Parentheses. He's a loser, and he's still better than you. Vriska brings up all the cool stuff Parentheses did, and by cool stuff, I mean horrific, violent crimes. It's a really bad sign that Vriska admires the other Vriska. Parentheses says that her quest for importance is futile. Her banishment to the Candy timeline is a big joke. She brings up that there was a version of Vriska who was happy. The other Parentheses Vriska. Pre-retcon Vriska. Oh god, this is complicated. Why are there so many Vriskas? Post-retcon parentheses Vriska says that she hated pre-retcon parentheses Vriska because she was happy and free. She got to be who she really was instead of trying to be the main character constantly. Vriska says post-parentheses can try to be better. Post-parentheses says if she was better, who would even be around to notice? The person she would want to become better for isn't around anymore. Pre-retcon parentheses was able to be happy with Terezi, a happiness the post-retcon parentheses Vriska was too much of an ass to ever achieve. Post-parentheses admits that she loves Terezi. Sorta, it's complicated. Vriska gives her John's phone, which she pickpocketed because she is just the worst. Post-parentheses finally messages Terezi. Hey, whatever happened to Terezi? Well, she finally made it to the final battle after everyone but John had either been killed or sucked into a black hole. As a reminder, John is at this point slowly bleeding out because Lord English's fang is buried in his chest. John says that it's only a flesh wound, then explains he's referencing Monty Python, which he actually doesn't like. The narration says that John thinks Terezi is cute. By the way, this is back when Al stole the narrator job from Dirk. Al insists that she has no desire to interject thoughts or sway intent or lie about the emotions people are feeling. And I don't believe that for a second, but yeah, I buy that John likes Terezi. As a reminder, Terezi is starving to death. John found his father's wallet earlier and opens it, releasing his car. Terezi eats shaving cream and tobacco. They rest in the car. John asks why Terezi is out there, and she is confused because he should know that she's looking for Vriska. Terezi says she's wasted her life and notes that John isn't as old as she thought he was. It isn't explicit, but I'm pretty sure Terezi doesn't know that this John is different from the one that she's been talking to and falling in love with. John says that they should go home, but Terezi asks to stay a little longer. She's still waiting for Vriska. John brings up the game over timeline and how amazing Terezi was in Fix This. Terezi tells him that she remembers, as shown in Terezi Remembers. She remembers how the other Terezi missed Vriska and was eventually happy with her. She says that she's devoted her life to those memories, to the idea that her and Vriska are soulmates, and for what? Vriska, as a reminder, is a huge bitch, blah blah. Terezi says that she's glad that they didn't all die in Game Over, but she doesn't feel it. She brings up Candy John's depression, how Earthsea was perfect, but he didn't feel it. John admits that he doesn't have a home to go back to. John offers to go back to Earthsea for some food so Terezi doesn't starve. She asks him to stay with her just a little longer, because what if he can't find her again? Terezi cuts the tooth out of John's stomach, and then they fuck in John's dad's car. Then that dick Dirk takes back control of the narrative. He makes fun of John for having no game and being head over heels in love with Terezi. Terezi finally gives up on Vriska. John asks her for a third time to come home with him. Except, John's really tired. He's dying. With the last of his strength, John zaps Terezi to the meat world. Dirk narrates that the poison in John's body can't be healed from. He rants that John never mattered, not like him or the cherubs. John was nothing more than a middling, unremarkable glob of glue Dirk used to fix the time loop, a tool that he no longer has any use for. John realizes that he was dead the moment he woke up at the start of the epilogues. Dirk says he's wrong. John could have chosen Candy, could have lived. But choosing meat was the best outcome for everyone, Dirk promises. John begins to say he loves Terezi, and Terezi forbids him from dying in the middle of a love confession. Wow, that came back around at a dark time. Dirk orders Terezi to grab the body. Terezi hears his narration and seals John's corpse in the wallet. Terezi decides to finally reconnect with the others. She runs into Roxy and assumes he is Dave because he has shades now. Dirk says that Roxy has reached the Super Saiyan 2 of gender, and I honestly forgot about that line when I wrote the trans hit jokes. Also a reminder, Dirk constantly misgenders Roxy because he doesn't respect him even slightly. Terezi, who can hear the narration, gets pissed. Roxy mentions that after seeing Al and freaking the fuck out, Calliope has stopped leaving the house. Now they just sit at home and paint out what's happening in the Candy timeline. Wait, is Meet Calliope the narrator of Candy? Roxy asks if John is okay because he's worried about him. Terezi lies and tells him that she hasn't seen John. Terezi gets Vriska's text and ignores it, which is just a painful bit of dramatic irony. This entire plotline is so tragic. The fact that Candy John and Terezi spend years falling in love and end the story thinking the other is dead. The fact that Terezi just barely misses Vriska and ends up in the opposite timeline from her, the fact that when Vriska is finally willing to reach out to Terezi, Terezi has finally given up on her. Terezi gets annoyed by Dirk's narration. He talks to her directly, saying she knows she doesn't belong on Earthsea. It isn't a place for people like them. He asks her to come with him and Rose and tells her she can bring John's corpse. Terezi decides to follow Dirk when he leaves Earthsea. Before leaving, Dirk gives Kanaya an antidote that wakes up Jade. Kanaya wakes up Jade, and Jade shouts that Dirk Strider has to be stopped. Dirk admits, yeah, he has to be stopped. Back at the start of Meet, Dirk explained the idea of a wrestling heel to Dave. In his pro wrestling show he does with Jake, everyone boos and throws things at Dirk because he plays himself up as a villain. But of course, everyone loves a good villain. They don't actually dislike him. He provides a perfect foil for Jake's heroism and charisma. I think that's how Dirk sees himself. He doesn't actually think he's a bad person. The way Dirk sees it, he's doing evil things because they have to happen. He has nobly stepped up and taken the role of villain because every story needs an antagonist. It needs to be stressed that Dirk is an infamously unreliable narrator. Some things, like his mind-raping of Jake, are clearly done for pettier, more personal reasons. Dirk is an asshole even if he thinks he has good motives. So, what are those motives? Dirk's primary goal is to stop the dissipation. He ensures that Meet is the canon timeline because he is appalled by the things that happen in Candy. But that isn't his only goal. Dirk wants Homestuck to continue. His entire existence was put on standstill when the comic ended, stuck in the limbo of a few slides in the credits. He wants the story to continue. No, he needs it to continue. So he does a bunch of evil shit and runs away, a sequel hook that keeps the universal mechanisms turning. He's the villain that Homestuck needs if the story is going to continue. And he doesn't just want to make a sequel, he wants to make a sequel that's better. The orange guy, the other orange guy, they fucked it up. They drove the story off the rails and turned it into something no one cared about. Hussey made the epilogues. Hussey ruined everything, and Dirk's gonna make it right. Of course, we've already seen what Dirk's definition of a good story is. Violence and blood and suffering dictated by an arrogant, remorseless deity. A lot of people take issue with Dirk becoming evil and consider it a regression of his character. I don't see it that way. I see it as a relapse into his negative behaviors, like a former alcoholic who returns to drinking. It's disappointing, but a single conversation on a rooftop isn't going to completely get rid of all of Dirk's issues. A thing I stressed back in October is that Dirk's most admirable trait is that he loves his friends and that he would never hurt them. Except, here's the loophole. Dirk thinks that what he's doing is good for them. He's protecting them from the Candy timeline. Much like another Dirk Strider, he justifies his abuse because he thinks he's making them better. Except, Dirk isn't actually helping his loved ones. Jane is the same fascist dictator in both timelines. Jake is arguably worse off in Meet. Jane treated him horribly in Candy, but Dirk condemns him to the same fate in Meet after tearing apart his mind, and I don't think Meet Jake will be able to stand up for himself like Candy Jake did. Roxy is a wash, they don't believe in regrets and are fine in both timelines. Rose is demonstrably worse off, although Dirk in his arrogance thinks she's better. Dave is the only one Dirk has actually helped. At the end of Meet, Dirk monologues that he's the villain, but actually, he's the hero because he's making the world a better place. He knows that by becoming the villain, it means he has to be stopped. He couldn't have wielded his power and not become a monster. He says he's considered killing himself to spare reality from the trauma he would bring. Not a fake suicide like the ones in Unite Synchronization or Candy, a real death. Except, Dirk is too cowardly to stop existing. He's too valuable to sacrifice himself. But still, Dirk claims he is willing to die if it means making the universe quote-unquote better. At the end of the story, he'll die a just death, decapitated by Dave, and that line pissed me off so much, I made an entire video essay so I could explain why it pisses me off so much. Stop trying to make Dave the hero. He doesn't want that. Making him be the big hero that kills his brother is the last thing Dave wants. That would be traumatizing and ruin Dave's life. No, it would be better if Dirk was killed by Kanaya, or John, or the person we aren't talking about. Actually, I have a whole long list of characters who I think should be allowed to take turns beating the shit out of Dirk for being an evil asshole. Back at the hospital with Jade, Kanaya is confused as to why Dirk needs to be stopped. Because there is no reason to doubt Dirk's good intentions, she explains that she'll miss Rose, but Dirk will take care of her better than she could. Roxy and Jade point out that Dirk kidnapped Rose. Kanaya says that she realized that she was being foolish, and it was no longer necessary for her to be Rose's spouse. Jade says that Dirk is fucking with her. Dirk decides to be merciful and allows Kanaya to realize the truth. Kanaya questions why she didn't talk to Rose. What was she thinking? Has she lost her fucking mind? Kanaya snaps out of Dirk's control and is pissed. She is going to make him pay. Fuck Dirk! Kanaya grabs Jade and demands she tell her how to find Dirk. Right then, Al begins possessing Jade again. Al says that Kanaya won't have to worry about Dirk as long as she remains on Earthsea and under her protection. Dirk points out that they won't remain. Kanaya confirms this. He has to be stopped, she pledges. Al says she could tell them how to stop Dirk, but she doesn't like to intervene. That's what makes her different from Dirk. Dirk says they couldn't stop him if they wanted to. He's already gone. Roxy and Kanaya bring Dave and Karkat in. Dave's mind instantly jumps to incest because Dave is Dave. Why is he like this? The conversation spirals out of control, and Dave says that Roxy can be his new daddy, and God, there is something wrong with Dave's brain. I blame Dirk. Dave starts kissing Karkat to annoy him. Al has Jade point in the direction of Dirk's ship. Dave treats her like a dog. Dave asks about John and deduces that John is with Dirk and Rose. Dave, Roxy, Karkat, and Kanaya take one of Jake's ships and take off after Dirk, bringing Jade's comatose body along. Their mission, kick Dirk's ass and save Rose and John. Al says their true mission is of much greater cosmic significance. Rose is firmly under Dirk's thrall and will not be easily pried away. John cannot be revived. His influence over Canon has come to an end, and ultimate sacrifice to avert the supreme dissipation. Al will accompany them on their journey and protect them from Dirk's influence. The only influence she will provide is as an unintrusive narrator, because if she were to insist on anything else, could she really be considered worthy of protecting the cosmos she describes? There are only a few more pages left to talk about now. At the end of Candy, after John's arc is completed, Jade and Dave are sent to put bombs in the shitty Statues of Liberty post-scratch Dave built. Dave notices a man-made structure and decides to explore it alone. As it turns out, it is the White House, which has a transportalizer. The transportalizer teleports Dave to a crypt containing the god-tier robes of a Hope player. Dave is greeted by the holographic force ghost of President Barack Obama. Dave is starstruck. I don't know if this is supposed to be ironic or if Hussey genuinely has a sycophantic love for Obama, but the payoff to Dave's Obama died for our sins bit in Meat, being Dave actually meeting Obama in Candy, is hilarious. Obama says that, once the Condens took over, he went into hiding and watched movie producer Dave's fruitless fight for mankind. Obama says the leadership is about seeing the long road and making the hard choices for the greater good. For example, yes, it's horrifically evil that he blew up weddings and hospitals using drone strikes that had a fucking 90% chance of killing people other than their targets, but he had to brutally murder those people, because otherwise the bloodthirsty fascists that make up the American voting public wouldn't have re-elected him, and if he wasn't re-elected, he couldn't have, let me check my notes here, been able to continue murdering civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama was such a great president, and not a war criminal who should spend the rest of his life in a tiny cell. To reiterate what I said in the Batman video, I don't like presidents. War Crimes McGee explains that he played the long game to ensure Earthsea was the best place for both the human race and the many newcomers. He says that post-scratch Rose and Dave didn't die in vain because they were fighting for something and their legacy inspired others. Obama explains that he died a heroic death, but says that it was classified and the fate of Paradox Space rested on it. Obama reveals that when he was 13, he was visited by a man claiming to be related to him, Grandad Harley. Obama snuck into one of Jake's outposts and was transported to the Medium, where he made friends. It isn't confirmed, but I'm pretty sure Obama is talking about the new session Dirk is planning in Beyond Canon, meaning, get ready for Obama to appear again, yay! Obama traveled to and from the Medium multiple times, eventually returning for the final time after his terms were done. Dave says he feels lesser than the Dave who murdered the insane clown posse. He entered Earthsea as a god and has felt hollow since, because he had nothing left to accomplish. Dave cries and says he still misses Dirk and Karkat. He He says he messed up and feels like he's living a lie because he's gay and doesn't love Jade. Obama says that he is also gay, but in his imagination. I am shocked that this is a thing that actually happened in real life. Obama says some faux philosophic stuff about hope, then transitions to talking about ultimate selves. Obama mentions that he met Dirk when he was younger, and that Dirk taught him about combat, philosophy, life, and love. Did Obama fuck Dirk? Did you fuck Dave's bro, Mr. President? Obama asks if Dave wants to die and be reborn as his ultimate self. Dave decides he's done just going through the motions and feeling hollow. He absorbs the memories of infinite timelines, becoming a ball of energy. Obama puts him in a robot body because, again, Obama really loves drone warfare. And I feel like this is such a sad ending for Dave. This is him accepting his destiny, becoming the hero who fights Dirk, rejecting his humanity and his loved ones in search of a purpose. And it's sad that, after a lifetime of emptiness, all Dave can hope for is to be like the Dave who died fighting an unstoppable evil. Meanwhile, Al talks with Aradia. Aradia realizes that the black hole is Al. Al explains that the Candy timeline exists within the black hole, which makes it safe but inescapable. She explains that not only is the Candy world non-canon, but if something narratively relevant ever happened there, it would create a corrosive paradox. Aradia asks why Al is protecting an irrelevant world. Al explains that she is protecting innocence from destruction, degradation, and dissolution. What's more, she's fighting Dirk, who is determined to jeopardize the canonical plane of reality. Al over-explains the concepts of narration that the reader already understands, and that Dirk has the ability to reshape the story to suit his agenda. There are 2 postscripts to the epilogues. Interesting, Candy ends with a scene from the Meat timeline where someone eats candy, while Meat ends with a scene from the Candy timeline where someone eats meat. In the Candy postscript, it is revealed that Comatose Rose is controlling a robot body. Also, Dirk makes her do his laundry because he is just the worst. Rose finds an Earth-like planet which is uninhabited for now. Dirk plans for him, Rose, and Terezi to create a new race and make them play the most important session in the history of Suburb. In the Meat postscript, Lord English's injured body lands on the Candy world. Al kills him and eats his corpse, gaining his powers. Al, Aradia, and Davebot leave through a wormhole to go fight Dirk. When the wormhole closes, it leaves an imaginary line. Above this line resides all that matters. Below exists all else. Never again the twain shall meet. Yeah, I call bullshit. The 2 worlds are definitely going to meet again. I mean, unless Beyond Canon gets cancelled again. Ha ha ha! So, there's one last question I'd like to ask before I end this. Oh god, 3-hour video? Why do I keep making long videos? Ugh. What about the epilogues is canon, and what does that even mean? And the answer is, I do not know. Yes, the concept of canon is discussed constantly by Rose, Dirk, and Al, except they all describe things in vague, flowery, navel-gazing diatribes, and are also all very unreliable narrators. Rose says that reality would dissipate if John didn't go fight Lord English, except Al claims she is protecting them from the dissipation. Dirk kills himself in Candy because nothing there matters, but he also considers the 7 years they spent on Earthsea before the epilogues began to be meaningless. And of course, John thinks that everyone else in Candy is a brain-dead NPC because it isn't true, but the whole goddamn point of Candy is that John is full of shit and that Roxy and the others are still sentient. And despite claims the meat is canon, the epilogues are referred to on the website as tales of dubious authenticity. Not authentic tale, and also a dubiously authentic tale. Tales, plural, of dubious authenticity. Here's what we know. In Meat, John completes the time loop that results in Lord English's creation. Or, at the very least, he makes sure the masterpiece happens, as does the fight afterwards. Except, that isn't the only thing that results in Lord English's creation. Calborn grew up on Earthsea after it was destroyed and everyone died. So, for the time loop to actually happen, everyone needs to die. It is never explained why Dirk needs Jane to win the election, but I think this is the reason. Because Jane is a fascist who will start a world war, which will end with everyone dying, except for her and Jake because they got sent to Problem Sleuth by Jaspros. The thing is, the war is actually happening on the Candy Earth. It would honestly be an incredible plot twist if, despite Dirk's machinations, the timeline where Calborn is born is actually Candy, if, despite everything, Candy was just as canon as Meat. I don't think that will happen because the narrators are pretty sure that Candy is non-canon, but it would be cool if it did happen. Actually, if we're being technical, neither timeline should be canon because John let Gamzee out of the fridge before the timelines branched. I mean, after the timelines branched, he went back before they branched. You know what I mean. Although I guess Gamzee from the original version of Collide could still end up in the Meat timeline because black holes teleport people between universes. Or maybe John only changed the past in the Candy timeline. I don't know. It's complicated. Meat is generally treated as the canon timeline, except I don't really get how a canon timeline can be influenced by something non-canon. Al narrates Meat from Candy, Terezi talks to Candy John while existing in Meat, and half a dozen characters have visions of things happening in alternate timelines. The epilogues aren't different stories, they're chained together, and that means that if one of them is canon, it would make sense if the other one was too. Maybe the thing that's tripping me up is the term canon. What if we thought of Meat as the Alpha timeline, and Candy as a Doom timeline that affects it? That happened constantly in Homestuck, except no one ever treated Doom timelines as not being true. They happened, and so did Candy. I think that because it's Homestuck, we need to look at this problem from a thematic perspective. It doesn't make sense considering John's conversation with Roxy for Candy to be untrue. The point is that it matters, that it all matters, or at the very least, that the people living in that timeline matter. Except if Candy's real, then what about Jane? What about her acting weird and out of character during Candy? Oh, there's an easy answer for that. She wasn't acting out of character, Jane is a fascist. And my evidence for this is that in Meat, the in-theory canonical timeline that is unaffected by the dissipation, Jane is still a fascist. Throughout the epilogues, characters are different in different timelines because of their different life experiences, but they're still recognizable as being the same people deep down. I think that Rose is wrong. They weren't changed by the world becoming an offshoot timeline. They were changed because they grew up. And it sucks that Jane is an unrecognizable asshole. It sucks that she is a bastardization of herself and that the justification for that bastardization is fake. But, I mean, people change. There are people out there who are nice when they're 15 and assholes when they're 40. I don't like this plot point. I think it's poorly handled, but I do think that Jane is meant to genuinely be an asshole, regardless of whether or not John fought Lord English. And I stand by my theory that the tiara top left lasting damage. The epilogues are flawed. They are messy. They rarely work as well as Hussey and the other writers wish they would. But beyond the layers of failed ideas, uncomfortable scenes, and bastardized characters, rests a story that is incredible. A story that is tragic and beautiful. A story that, if I'm being honest, touched me emotionally. I think the epilogues are good. I don't think any work has ever affected me as much as Homestuck. I love this comic, faults and all. It changed me as a person and as a writer. It was well written, but it wasn't a normal story. It was a story that played around with tropes and the basic building blocks of writing to make something unique, that deconstructed the very framework of its medium. And maybe it would have been better if it was a more conventional story. But then, it wouldn't have been Homestuck. I see fan sequels or rewrites that strip away the meta elements of Homestuck, that get rid of Caliborn's chapters or the retcon or the ending, and I don't like that approach, because the meta aspect of Homestuck is one of its defining attributes. I think that the epilogues, as messy as they are the only sequel Homestuck could have had. It had to be something like this. The epilogues were not a standalone story. The epilogues left John and Dirk's arcs in satisfying places, but it is very clear that the epilogues were setting up a sequel. And 6 months later, that sequel came out and it was bad. Like, I just spent 3 hours defending the epilogues. I don't hide my opinions, so believe me when I say that Homestuck, 2, Beyond Canon wasn't very good. But it was not bad for the reasons people say. People say it was bad because of that character I'm not talking about, and that's stupid. That's more hating a musical because it features music. No, Homestuck 2 was bad because it's boring. Part of the problem was that it started out with such a wide cast. Homestuck also had a wide cast, but it rarely focused on the entire cast at once. Like, when it introduced the trolls, the comic put the rest of the characters to the side, and after it mixed the trolls back in with the old characters, Hussey killed off the irrelevant ones to streamline the story. In Act 6, the comic repeatedly switched between focusing on established characters and new ones. To give Hussey credit, they knew how to manage a large cast and develop a bunch of different plot lines at once. Homestuck 2 featured almost the entire cast of Homestuck, plus second versions of most of the characters, plus 4 new protagonists. It spent hundreds of pages on setup, but kept switching focus to the point where after hundreds of pages, very little had actually happened. Let's see. Dirk landed on his new planet, Jade took back her body, pumped that counter up to 13, was introduced and rescued, there was a bunch of exposition, and wow, 400 pages and that's really all that happened? And I mean, Homestuck also took its sweet time getting to the good stuff, but Homestuck had the advantage of focusing on a smaller cast, being more unique, and coming out at an unhealthily fast pace. I don't think any one person should have made a comic as fast as Andrew Hussie, but 11 people? I feel like that should have been enough for the comic to actually move past the prologue over the course of a year. Also, the writing seemed to take a big step down from the Epilogues, which, as a reminder, had an almost completely different creative team. To be fair, the Epilogues started bad and then became really good. Maybe the original team could have made something good eventually, but they didn't get the chance. Animosity that began during the Epilogues increased during Homestuck 2, and the comic was eventually cancelled. And thus Homestuck ended with dangling plot hooks and unfinished character arcs. All of the build-up that was the Epilogues was essentially wasted. You know, a sentiment I've seen a lot is amazement that Homestuck actually ended. That after 1,000,000 words, it finally finished in a satisfying way. It sucks that the Homestuck franchise ended the way that it did. And that is how I would have ended this video if I made it a year ago when I first announced it. Except, 3 years after Homestuck 2 was cancelled, it returned with a completely new writing team headed by James Roach. They dropped the squared from the title. It's just Homestuck beyond canon now. And it's fine. I've liked some of the character moments, but honestly, it's been a lot of the same. I'm reminded of that Hussie quote from the third printed book, which inspired the Epilogues. The dichotomy of meat and candy. The problem with Homestuck 2 and beyond canon still is that it's all candy. Like, seeing Dave and Karkak get together is fine. Terezi having a monologue about her lack of purpose is fine. Al narrating that reality is contorting is fine, but you need to have the moment where the story shifts, where some stunning, high-octane emotional moment shakes the reader and makes them give a shit about the story. I want to fear for the safety of these characters. I want to see them grow as people and have arcs. I want to see the big confrontation the Epilogue set up that 600 pages later, we're no closer to witnessing. I want to break from this toothache. And well, that's the end of the video. There is nothing more to talk about. No topic that I have avoided talking about again and again and again that people are begging me to talk about. Yeah, video over. Fine, I'll talk about Yiffy. Her existence is foreshadowed constantly in the Epilogues. Basically, Candy Jade wanted a child because she was lonely. Dave didn't want kids. Also, they can't have kids together biologically because Jade has a penis because she was fused with a male dog. Hence the nodding jokes. People, don't like that plot element. And after 4 years, I'm officially sick of discourse about Jade's penis. Shut up about Jade's penis. I don't fucking care about Jade's penis. When the comic was relaunched, there was an entire army chanting in unison about Jade's penis. Are you getting rid of Jade's penis? What about her penis? People hate the Epilogues because of Jade's penis. And again, that was in the sequel. And I'm gonna be honest, the sheer revulsion kinda rubs me the wrong way. It's a stupid plot point, but also seeing a lot of people say, that woman has a penis, ew, I hate this comic. And also the transgender icon hit from Dragon Ball is a bit unnerving. I mean, part of it is being grossed out by the furry aspect, but I don't think that's the main reason for some people. Anyway, Jay didn't want adoption or ecto-clones, so she asked Rose to be a surrogate. Rose said sure, because in the Candy timeline, Rose does not give a shit about anything and treats her life like a joke. They did not tell Kanaya or Dave or anyone else but Jane for some reason. Honestly, the real bad part, more than the woman with a penis, ew, is that Rose was just a terrible, terrible wife to Kanaya, and the capper to all this is that they named her Yiffy Longstocking Lalonde Harley. They named her Yiffy Longstocking Lalonde Harley. They named her Yiffy Longstocking Lalonde Harley. Honestly, the weirdest part of that name is the Lalonde bit, because Rose was just a surrogate. Jade's the one who raised and mollycoddles Yiffy, much to her annoyance. Hot take, I think that Yiffy should have appeared in Candy. It's weird that all of her foreshadowing goes nowhere, and weird that only 3 of the Omega kids are actually introduced. Also, I think she works better as a plot point in Candy, because that's the epilogue where all the weird, stupid fanfiction shit happens, and Yiffy Longstocking Lalonde Harley is a black hole singularity of weird, stupid fanfiction shit. Fans fucking hated Yiffy's introduction, but let's put on our thinking caps. Homestuck 2 introduced a character whose existence is a plot hole, then specifically showed that Dirk fucking Strider is terrified of her. I think there's probably a plot reason for this being stupid, beyond Hussey made something stupid because they're a bad writer. Then again, the fact that Dirk's fear was shown in the Patreon exclusive bonus pages was a bit of a mistake. Also, how Yiffy was introduced was really bad. Like, a good example of how the writing has improved since the relaunch is comparing Kanaya's nonchalance to Yiffy in Homestuck 2 to her undying rage in Beyond Canon. The point is, given the fact that Andrew Hussey demanded Yiffy's inclusion, I think it's fair to say that she exists for the purpose of telling a postmodern metatextual story. You know, like in Homestuck. I don't know if the new writing team will pull it off, but I feel like you could tell a really good story about narrative involving Yiffy. I have written one, link in the description. Hey look, I'm plugging my fanfiction, how fitting. Her backstory is dumb, but Yiffy is actually the best Omega kid by far. The others I feel nothing but apathy towards, but Yiffy, she's an untethered ball of rage and annoyance who keeps smashing shit. I want to watch her continue to smash shit. That is my take on Yiffy, that her backstory is dumb, but she is a fun character. And that's the end. For real this time. Should you read the Homestuck epilogues? I think so. I think if you liked Homestuck, give them a chance. Read them with an open mind, and you'll find a really touching story. I know I just spoiled every plot point, but they're actually really good on a reread, just like Homestuck.